Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
It can't be. I robbed her of her money. The ex-husband froze when he saw his rich wife on TV. In one of Jersey City's parks, children were frolicking, couples were strolling, and young mothers with strollers were relaxing after household chores. Christopher stood by a small fountain, holding a single rose. His hands were trembling with excitement. The young, handsome 20-year-old was waiting for his girlfriend Allison, who was already 20 minutes late. She can't not show up, the young man thought to himself. Christopher had been dating Allison for a couple months now, and he'd never had her late or ignore a meeting. Finally, he saw her thin silhouette in the distance. She wasn't walking, she was floating down the road. Her gait was so graceful and airy. Christopher was tired of waiting for the time to come. He walked towards her, and as soon as the girl approached, Christopher noticed that the expression on her face was sad. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I knew you had some kind of misfortune." Christopher was worried and hugged his favorite girl. Allison didn't hug him back and didn't take the flower. The girl, embarrassed, didn't want to tell the reason for her sadness. Christopher looked her straight in the eyes and asked her to keep quiet. "I'm beginning to worry," he said. "Is your grief so great that you can't even share it with me?" "My grief is you," Allison said, and looked up at Christopher. He tensed. He hadn't done her any harm, hadn't hurt her in any way. He was generally trying to do his best to make Allison happy. He asked for clarification on exactly how he could have spoiled his beloved's mood. "You're very nice, but I'm tired of walking in parks and sitting on benches," Allison said. "You've never once invited me to a restaurant, never given me anything but these roses. You realize I need a man around me, not a boy. There's no hope for you. I can't see you as my rock." "You can just say you don't want to have a relationship with a poor man," Christopher said. The boy was insulted, humiliated, and angry. Because of this, he himself was well aware that he had no money. Christopher couldn't give Allison an expensive gift, invite her even to a movie. That would undoubtedly do a lot of damage to his wallet. "How can I have money if I'm only 20? Christopher didn't understand. "We still have a long way to go. You and I are going to grow and develop together." Allison waved her head. "I don't want to wait, I don't want to grow, and I don't want to drag anyone forward," she replied. "I want a grown-up, established man." Christopher didn't seem like the kind of man who could ever accomplish anything. Her words cut him to the core. 10 years had passed since then, and he still hadn't forgotten Allison's words. He never met that girl again. How she turned out, he didn't know. But Christopher had learned that all women were only after money, and no one was interested in sincere feelings. Allison gave him a prejudice against all girls at once. Christopher could not build a serious relationship and did not even try to get close to anyone for quite a long time. By the way, there was some truth in Allison's statement. Christopher really did not aspire to a lot of money. He had misunderstood the girl. She wasn't saying that the guy was indigent and couldn't do anything in this life. She just wanted a different standard of living. She wanted to live a rich life, and Christopher could only give her an average one. She tried to explain this to him, but it was all pointless. Christopher wasn't looking for a big paycheck. He was the kind of man who believed that big money could not be earned by honest labor. So he didn't even try. He always said that rich people were either lucky or crooks. But he never thought he would fall into one of those categories, or maybe both. Christopher was already 30 years old when he met Elizabeth. He was working at a car repair shop, and an expensive car had been brought to him. It was the kind of brand their auto repair shop had never seen before. When Christopher saw the owner of the car, his jaw nearly dropped to the floor. Elizabeth noticed the surprise. She was even pleased. The young businesswoman herself offered Christopher her phone number. She didn't look at the lack of men. She could take care of herself and fulfill her own desires. And Christopher thought for the first time that with a girl like Elizabeth he could try to build something serious. Elizabeth certainly didn't seem mercantile to him in this situation. Rather, he was becoming a keeper. Of course, the man did not assume that a rich girl could consider him as a potential fiancé. But already after the first date, it was clear that Elizabeth was not looking for a one-night stand. Although she was rich, she did not have the main treasure. She was lonely. But it couldn't be said that Christopher was her last option. No, she did take an interest in the simple car mechanic. And Christopher fell in love with Elizabeth. And not just for the money. 6 months into their relationship, he and Elizabeth were married. One day the man caught himself thinking that he was the lucky man he had thought of with contempt throughout his life. The man himself did not seem to have fully realized what he loved more than Elizabeth herself, or the life she had provided for him. And Elizabeth had spared nothing for the one she loved. Christopher no longer needed to work at the auto shop. He was learning the intricacies of running a business. Elizabeth thought about giving him his own car service for their anniversary. But for now, it was just a thought. In principle, she was happy with everything as it was. She was just worried that her spouse might consider himself uncomfortable with the fact that he lived at his wife's expense. But Christopher didn't feel any inferiority. He was more than happy with everything. Elizabeth and Christopher decided to celebrate the first anniversary of their marriage alone with each other without any lavish festivities. The couple booked a table at a restaurant. Before that, they took a boat ride. It was a day just for the two of them. But their plans were not destined to materialize. Throughout the day, Elizabeth received calls from her assistant, Ben. The young man couldn't get through. First, Elizabeth hung up, and then she turned off the phone so that nothing distracted her from communicating with her husband. Ben wrote messages that went unanswered. Eventually, he found out that his boss was celebrating her anniversary at a restaurant, so she was ignoring his calls. Ben had a lot of reasons to worry, and some pretty serious ones. There was no putting off the conversation. In the middle of the evening, when Elizabeth and Christopher were about to exchange gifts, her assistant burst into the restaurant. The girl still hadn't gotten the papers for the car service she was going to present to her spouse. "Elizabeth Igorevna, we agreed with you that if I call more than 3 times, it means that there is trouble," Ben said, panting. He was obviously running to the boss with all his legs. That was why his breathing was labored. Well, what could have been so serious on Saturday, Elizabeth didn't understand. If it was really urgent, you could have written a message and then called. The assistant replied that it wasn't just urgent, it was an emergency. He offered to step aside and talk, but Elizabeth told him she had no secrets from her husband. "You're due for an inspection on Monday," Ben told her. "And it will be the kind of inspection that will find exactly what it's looking for," he added. "We've been through so many of these inspections already that it's simply impossible to intimidate me with them," Elizabeth replied with a laugh. She always used this particular form of her employee's name when she wanted to show that she considered his words to be a mere trifle. "We've been set up this time," Ben said seriously. "Your partner, with whom, let's face it, we weren't exactly working a clean scheme, has been cooperating with the police and with the IRS. He himself was recently nailed, which is why he wants to pull you out after him." Elizabeth tensed. She was starting to worry now, too. She wanted to hug Ben, to thank him for being able to find her after all. But there was no time for tenderness. She needed to find out what Elizabeth was in danger of being tested, and what she could do to avoid the consequences. "Unfortunately, Elizabeth, it could get you jail time," Ben said without joy at all. "And there is only one way to avoid it." Elizabeth was literally numbed by the words of her assistant. She had never expected that one of her business partners could set her up so seriously. The girl conducted her business honestly, without gray schemes and fraud. And she always trusted her partners. It turns out that it was someone's planned scheme to get her out of the game. Ben said that the person who set it all up agreed to go along with it only if Elizabeth would hand over the business to him. But she'd still have to face an audit from the IRS. "How can I get out of this situation?" Elizabeth didn't understand. "You said there was an option, but I don't see any way out. I can't give my business to someone I don't know." "Unfortunately, if you don't sign over all your assets to someone else, you'll be ruined," Ben said. Christopher sat silent the whole time. He didn't understand anything about his wife's affairs. The only thing he could realize was that she was in deep trouble. Elizabeth was crying bitterly, completely confused. Christopher stood next to his beloved and hugged her. The girl clung to his arm. "But you can sign everything over to someone you trust," Ben suggested. "We'll declare you bankrupt. If you don't have anything, there's nothing to take away. It's better to hand everything over to someone close to you than to an obscure character who just wants to make a profit at your expense. Elizabeth raised her tearful eyes to the assistant, looking at him as if her whole life depended on his words. She was so depressed and frightened that she was unable to think straight. Ben had caught the boss by surprise at a moment when she was as happy and relaxed as possible. The news of the impending setup had stunned her. That's what the man was counting on. At any other moment, the girl would have realized that this was some kind of divorce, but now she didn't see the illogic and inconsistency in his words. You can sign everything over to your parents or to your next of kin, Ben reasoned. Or someone you trust. Maybe someone from the company? You know very well that I have no parents, no brothers, no sisters, Elizabeth answered him. She thought Ben was alluding to himself, but he might not have counted on it because Elizabeth couldn't trust him at that moment. She continued to hold Christopher's hand and suddenly realized, I'll sign the company over to my husband now, she said. That won't arouse suspicion. But the husband is also a close relative, Ben said. Elizabeth looked at Christopher and asked him if he would be willing to take on that responsibility. Ben looked displeased. He was clearly expecting the company to go to him. Christopher didn't answer anything, just froze in one pose, as if he wanted to avoid being noticed. Either I go to prison, Elizabeth said. But if your husband doesn't want to be involved in your affairs, we can think about it, Ben added uncertainly. He agrees, Elizabeth said without looking at the assistant. Well, I guess he does, Christopher said uncertainly. It's like I don't have a choice. I will prepare all the documents and come to your house tomorrow to sign them, Ben said quickly. The assistant congratulated Elizabeth and Christopher on their anniversary, wished them a good evening, and hurried away. At last he looked very intently at Christopher. The man could not decipher the emotion that lurked in his gaze. A calm and happy continuation of the evening was out of the question. Elizabeth didn't bother to give her gift. The next morning Ben came even earlier than Elizabeth, and Christopher had time to clean up. The aide had to wait, and at breakfast they sat down together at the table. I thought a lot about what you said last night, Elizabeth said while Ben was preparing the papers. She had indeed thought about what the assistant had told her, but she didn't analyze his words. Didn't try to find a setup. Elizabeth was thinking about exactly how she could avoid the consequences. It seemed to her that simply transferring the company to her husband was not enough. Christopher and I should probably get a divorce, she said. Christopher immediately rose from his seat. Ben darted his eyes at his boss. So what do you think? Do you think the IRS employs fools? Elizabeth reasoned. They won't realize we just redid the paperwork when they smell something fishy. If we're divorced, there'll be fewer questions. Don't worry and don't do anything rash, Ben cautioned Elizabeth. First of all, we'll do it retroactively. Secondly, we need it more for the competitor than for verification. After all, he wants to deal with you specifically, not your case. Liz. I don't like this, said Christopher, who had just been standing there. I'm definitely not getting a divorce. Elizabeth sighed, waving her hand. Give me your papers, she said. Doombly, she leafed through a couple of documents, but more for the sake of appearances, she didn't even read what was written there. She had no reason not to trust Ben. They'd been working together for years. The documents are signed. The assistant put everything in a folder and promised to straighten everything out. Expect my call with good news, Ben said. Elizabeth thanked him and finally touched her cup of coffee, which had already managed to become cold. By evening, it had come to Elizabeth's attention that she hadn't gotten herself a copy of the paperwork, that the whole thing was kind of weird in general. In short, Elizabeth began to realize that she had made a mistake. She quickly grabbed her phone and texted her assistant to bring or courier her a copy of the contract. You don't look well at all, said Christopher, who was suddenly at Elizabeth's side. I suggest you have a glass of your favorite wine and calm down. He took out a bottle and a glass, quickly filled it, and handed it to his wife. Elizabeth took the drink, thanking him. She stared at one point and thought about something of her own. I think I did the stupidest thing of my life today, she said quietly and took a sip. You're just nervous, aren't you? Christopher tried to reassure her. You've been thinking about it all day, so you've been having strange thoughts. Have some wine, lie down and rest. Today is done, and tomorrow there will be other things to do. New worries, fresh thoughts. Elizabeth asked Christopher to sit down next to her. As soon as he lowered himself onto the couch, the girl laid her head on his shoulder. She was swollen from just one sip, immediately pulled to sleep. You're right. I'm so tired that I don't know what I'm thinking. My eyes are closing, Elizabeth said. Don't fight it, Christopher said, stroking her head. You need to rest. You didn't sleep much the night before. You've been on edge all day today, so take care of yourself. Elizabeth relaxed in the warm embrace of her lover, took a couple more sips, set the glass on the small table near the sofa, then returned her head to her husband's shoulder and gradually slid into his lap. Christopher continued to stroke Elizabeth's hair and tell her that everything would be all right. He was scared himself, but he held on for the sake of keeping Elizabeth from worrying even more. Someone had to keep a cool head. Elizabeth hadn't opened her eyes yet, but she already realized something was wrong. Her head ached as if she had emptied several bottles of wine last night instead of just a few sips. She didn't want to open her eyes, so Elizabeth decided to sleep a little longer. She rolled over onto her other side and froze. She realized she wasn't in her own bed because she felt a huge, hard pillow under her head. It was like the one her grandmother had in the village. Elizabeth had always thought it weighed 50 pounds and could kill someone if she wanted to. In her house, there were no such pillows in any bedroom. No sofa could have such a thing. Her cheek was stabbed and feathery. And that feeling, too, was from a distant childhood. Elizabeth remembered perfectly well how unpleasant it was to show the sharp tips of feathers through pillowcases, and she would pull them out of the fabric and examine them. And Granny would scold every time she found a pile of those feathers and fluff under the bed. Elizabeth still risked opening her eyes. She couldn't lie there forever and avoid reality. The room was dusky, but there was a glimpse of sunlight through the thick curtains, indicating that the time had definitely passed the afternoon. The girl did not realize where she was. She couldn't see the room, only a thin line of light from the window, which showed dust particles flying around the room. Elizabeth got out of bed, sliding the curtains open. Outside the window, she saw a wooden fence and a lot of bushes of some kind. It felt like she was at a country house or in a village. She even thought she heard cows mooing somewhere in the distance. Elizabeth slowly turned around in the room and guessed from the furnishings that she had actually found herself in an incomprehensible way in a poor village cottage. The room contained the bed from which the girl had risen a few minutes ago, a stove, a table with a white tablecloth, and a closet. Elizabeth did not understand anything. Never before had she been in this place. How had she ended up here in the first place? The last thing Elizabeth remembered from last night was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine and her husband Christopher beside her. There was no way she could have drunk so much to completely forget everything. Elizabeth didn't have her ID or phone with her. She stayed in the homemade clothes she had been wearing yesterday. How she had gotten to this place was unclear, but one thing was clear: she had to go home. Elizabeth walked towards the exit. When she left the room, she found herself in the kitchen, which was also a hallway. Near the door, she noticed her suitcase, immediately opened it. Inside were several things that someone had hastily left. They were not folded, they were lying in a heap. In a separate pocket lay a passport and a few other documents. Very interesting, Elizabeth stretched out. Did I run away from home or something? Apparently something happened yesterday that made me run away from home. But I couldn't reconstruct the events of the previous day at all. All I remembered was the evening by the fireplace, my head on Christopher's shoulder, and the glass in front of me. I only took a couple sips. There was no way that amount of alcohol could have caused my memory loss. Elizabeth rummaged through more of her suitcase, hoping to find a cell phone there. But there was nothing there. Without that gadget, the girl certainly wouldn't run. She couldn't imagine her life without a smartphone at all. Elizabeth stepped outside. The sunlight hurt her eyes, which were used to semi-darkness. The girl put her palm to her forehead to cover herself a little from the sun and looked around. There were several other huts nearby, as poor and dilapidated as the one in which she had awakened. Some of the huts were definitely abandoned, but the closest one was clearly inhabited. And suddenly Elizabeth noticed an old woman sitting on a bench in the yard of a neighboring house. The girl decided that she could help her. In fact, Elizabeth was very happy when she saw someone alive in the middle of nowhere. She immediately ran up to her neighbor. As she got closer, Elizabeth discovered that the neighbor was not the infirm old woman she had thought she was at first sight. It was just that she was dressed in a very rustic way that gave age. "How do you do?" Elizabeth said. "I apologize for disturbing you, but could you tell me where I am and how I came to be here?" The neighbor looked at her carefully. The woman's eyes were so pale, as if transparent. She seemed to know something, but she was in no hurry to tell. "My name is Elizabeth," she introduced herself, thinking it would help her to make the old woman feel at ease. "She's alive," after all, the neighbor suddenly said, which completely disconcerted Elizabeth. "I saw them bringing you in yesterday. I thought they were trying to close the crime. I almost called the police. But there's no cell phone service here." Elizabeth asked the woman to tell her what she'd seen, and then remembered to get the stranger's name. "My name is Mary Adams," the neighbor replied. "I suffer from insomnia. I couldn't sleep last night, and then I heard something. It was late at night. A car came to the window. The car was parked in front of the neighbor's house," said Mary. "I thought my old lady was coming back. But no. 2 men got out of the car, carried you in their arms, carried you into the house, and drove away." Elizabeth, barely able to stay on her feet, asked Mary to describe the men. "I know it was dark, but can you remember anything? Or the make of the car?" Elizabeth asked, folding her arms across her chest in a gesture of pleading. "I could see clearly. They were shining their headlights so bright that half the village could see them," Mary Adams replied, describing the 2 men who had carried Elizabeth into the house. The girl listened to Mary and could not believe her ears, trying to find some excuses and explanations. She hoped the old woman was wrong after all, but there could be no doubt. After the neighbor described the car, Elizabeth was already sure that her husband and her assistant had brought her here. But how was that possible? Elizabeth didn't even know they knew each other. To her mind, the whole thing was just unthinkable. "Did they talk about anything?" she asked. "I can't tell you that now," Mary Adams replied. "I see well for my age, but I don't hear very well. Not even a little," the old woman said guiltily. It was impossible to hear anything. Elizabeth thanked her neighbor once again, went back to her new home. Mary Adams shouted to her that the house was abandoned, so she could stay there as long as she saw fit. "And you can come and see me. I'm the only one living here," she added. "Thanks, but I'm going into town. By the way, can you tell me how to get there?" Elizabeth stopped and asked. The girl stood at the bus stop and borrowed some money from Mary Adams for transportation. She left her things with her too, because she didn't want to carry a suitcase. All she took with her was her passport. She had to walk to her house, which was in the most remote part of the city. Her cottage was located in a place that was considered elite. It was something like a village for the rich. The only way to get there was with a pass, which Elizabeth didn't have with her, of course. But the guard at the gate let her in for old time's sake. What confused her was that he did so reluctantly. "Peter Stephen, have you already forgotten me for one night?" Elizabeth joked. But all she got in response was the guard's embarrassment and a guilty look. "You will go to the house and find out everything there. I'm forbidden to let you in, and I'll probably get a lot for disobeying orders," Peter replied after a long pause. Elizabeth did not understand anything, although she was beginning to guess. Only yesterday she had signed the papers transferring her business to her husband, and today she had been chased out of the house. The only thing she couldn't understand was why she wasn't allowed in the house. It had nothing to do with the company anymore. Elizabeth rang the bell. At the gate, the door was opened by an unfamiliar man. It was the guard. Elizabeth guessed from the uniform. "This is my house. Let me in," she said calmly. "Not true. The mistress is home now." The guard answered her. "This is the first time I've ever seen you." "No wonder, since it's the first day you've worked here." Elizabeth laughed nervously. "Get out of my way. I'm the boss." Just then Elizabeth noticed a young girl behind the guard. She was strolling across the courtyard in an icy silk robe. Elizabeth couldn't stand it. She tried to lunge at the imposter, but the guard grabbed the girl and threw her straight to the ground. "What's going on here?" Elizabeth screamed. "I'm in some parallel universe." The girl, who was strolling through the courtyard, noticed the guest, walked smoothly to the gate, and looked at Elizabeth haughtily. "This is my home now," said the stranger, smiling smugly. "And Christopher is mine at last. And you can go wherever you like, but don't set foot here again." So Elizabeth wasn't crazy. It was all Christopher's doing. That was Elizabeth's suspicion, but she couldn't understand why she didn't own the house either. The only place she could find out the truth was in her office. That's where Elizabeth decided to go. She had to walk again, because she didn't even have money for a cab. She was terrified of being kicked out of her own company, but she had to talk to her husband, no matter what it took. She approached the building where her office was located, noticing that the guards had changed there as well. When only he had time to organize all this, the girl wondered. She had already guessed that she wouldn't be allowed in here now either. But she had to talk to Christopher at any cost. She was lucky she saw that her car, which apparently didn't belong to her anymore either, had pulled into the parking lot. Christopher got out of the car, wearing a nice business suit and a very satisfied look on his face. His face showed that he felt he was the ruler of the world. He's getting into character fast, Elizabeth thought. She ran up to the bridge, jumped on him from behind and started hitting him on the shoulders, on the head, shouting insults, while the passers-by watched with interest. The guards ran out of the building and took Elizabeth off Christopher's back. The girl, mad with anger, waved her hand at them, saying, "It's okay, he'll sort it out." But as soon as the guard let Elizabeth go, she threw herself at her husband again and began to beat him with her palms. She didn't know how to fight, she just swung her arms left and right, not even looking where she was hitting. One of the guards grabbed her by the waist, and Elizabeth continued to flail her arms and legs like a bug that has fallen on its back and can't turn over. "I understand your anger, but don't embarrass yourself," Christopher said. "Why are you driving my car? Is there a girl walking around in my house?" Elizabeth shouted. "I've already realized that you've taken the company away from me, but what does that have to do with the property?" "You should have read the documents you signed more carefully," Christopher said calmly. Elizabeth froze. She was no longer hysterical. She realized that she had signed over everything to him. She had no chance of getting anything back. "Was your mistress in the house?" she asked with a hint of contempt. "How long have you been with her?" "It doesn't matter," Christopher said. "Get out of here before they force you out. You're free to go. The divorce petition has already been filed." Elizabeth was released. She didn't throw herself, she stayed where she was and just watched her traitorous husband go to her office, where he would run her business, live in her house and drive her car. She was so stunned by her spouse's insolence and meanness that she couldn't cry or get angry, nothing. And then she noticed Ben coming out of the office. The former assistant was obviously in a great mood, walking almost at a gallop. Elizabeth rushed over to him. "Why did you do that?" she asked, grabbing Ben by his jacket. He was scared. He hadn't expected to see his former boss. He tried to say something, but he couldn't get a complete sentence out of his mouth out of excitement. He said he didn't know anything, that it was all Christopher's plan. And he wasn't lying about the tests. They were indeed planned. "How could you not know when you brought me documents to sign that said I was giving my husband all my assets? Did you deliberately frame your speeches to confuse me as much as possible? To panic me?" "I really didn't know. They slipped me the wrong papers," Ben continued to lie. "You brought me into the house. Elizabeth came by with Christopher. Did the neighbors see you? Stop lying to me. You set this whole thing up together. By the way, why don't I remember anything?" Guilt. I was interrupted. Ben lowered his eyes. He realized that there was no point in lying anymore. His complicity in this crime was obvious. And then behind the man's back, some girl screamed. "Oh, brother." Elizabeth recognized that voice at once. It was that thin, gentle voice that had told her hours ago that she was no longer welcome in the house. Ben's face showed that he was not happy with the situation. He didn't want his former boss to know his motives for this deception. "So that's what this is all about," Elizabeth said when she saw the girl. "It's your sister. Have you taken care of the family welfare?" "Elizabeth, you were told to leave." "Go on your way," Ben said when he realized there was no point in hiding anymore. "You can't prove anything. If you go to the police, they'll send you straight to forensics. Elizabeth didn't understand. What kind of examination would they send her to? But Ben quickly explained to her that she had blacked out the day before for a reason. The girl had already guessed that something had been spiked in her wine, and the assistant confirmed it. The police have been alerted to your case. Unless you want to end your days in a mental institution or behind bars, you'd better not go to the police, Ben warned her. You've done your homework, Elizabeth said through gritted teeth, clenching her fists. Ben's sister, Sandy, hid behind him because she saw Elizabeth's fighting spirit, but her brother reassured her. Sandy, don't worry. She won't have time to hurt you. The guards are already on standby, he said. Elizabeth decided to take her almost ex-husband's advice and not embarrass herself anymore. She walked Ben and her sister to the door and then kicked her former assistant's car with all her might. Security guards immediately ran out of the office, and Elizabeth rushed out. She stopped when she had run out of strength and there was no pursuit. Elizabeth was literally gasping for breath. She had never run so much and so fast before. If she could escape from the guards, she could not escape from her own thoughts. Elizabeth realized that through her own stupidity and carelessness, she had lost everything she had earned and accumulated through years of hard work. Elizabeth sobbed. She sat upright on the ground, leaning her back against some unremarkable stall. "Girl, are you scaring my customers like this?" said the indignant stall clerk, who had been listening to Elizabeth crying and mumbling to herself for a long time. But when the woman saw Elizabeth, her mood changed. She realized that the poor girl was in trouble. She could tell by the crying. But Elizabeth looked decent, so she was trustworthy. The woman even asked if Elizabeth needed any help. "If it is not difficult to borrow $3 from me for a ticket to the village," said the girl. "I'm asking for a loan. When I have the money, I will definitely pay you back." "Take one," said the woman and handed Elizabeth a bill. "We'll pay it back, or we won't. That's another matter. At least you can buy yourself something to eat." Elizabeth was also ashamed to accept the handout, but she was in no position to refuse it. She promised herself that she would be sure to pay back Mary Adams, who had given her money for her journey from the village. With that saleswoman, she was sure she would find a way out of the hole she had fallen into through her own gullibility and foolishness. Elizabeth returned to the village. She didn't know where else to go. She had no place in the city in which to find shelter, and here some of her belongings remained, and at least one acquaintance who was willing to take in and help was sweet old Mary Adams. "Yes, the boys are very brazen these days," Mrs. Adams said, listening to Elizabeth's story of how she came to be in this village. The girl had bought the cheapest waffles and cake for her neighbor to thank her for her help. They sat in the kitchen drinking tea. Mary Adams was thinking about how she could help the unfortunate girl, and Elizabeth was thinking about how she could get out of her plight. Though she was engaged in business, she had failed to make any useful connections. The girl did not participate in dubious schemes, did not give bribes, so she could not agree with anyone. The partners did not care who ran her company, she herself or her ex-husband. Mary offered Elizabeth to stay the night at her house, but Elizabeth declined. She felt that she had already squeezed the woman too much. There was no light in the house Christopher and Ben had put her in, but Elizabeth didn't need it. She lit a candle she'd also borrowed from a neighbor. It was enough. It seemed to Elizabeth that she would not be able to sleep and would think about her problems all night. But her strength left her, and she fell asleep as soon as she put her head on the pillow. In the morning, Elizabeth decided to make some improvements to her new home. There was no telling how long she would have to spend here. She wanted to create some semblance of comfort. For the first time, she noticed the decoration of the room. The house seemed to have been abandoned not too long ago. Dust had already accumulated on the shelves, but it didn't look like it had been there for years. In the kitchen drawers, there were still packets of pasta, cereal with expiration dates that hadn't expired. The first thing Elizabeth did was dust. She decided to find a rag and suddenly noticed a note in the most prominent place in front of the front door. She assumed it was a message from her ex-husband to her. With trembling hands, she took the note, began to read it, and from the very first line she realized that the letter was not meant for her. It began with the words, "My dear daughter." Her mother had died a long time ago. She couldn't have left a note for her. But Elizabeth didn't stop reading. The letter was from the woman who owned the house to her daughter. She apologized to her, hoping that her daughter might remember her one day, maybe decide to visit. But the former owner of the house had moved away. She gave her daughter an address where she could find her, begged her to come visit her mother. Elizabeth wiped away the tear that rolled down her cheek after reading the message. So much maternal love and pain in those words written in pencil with a trembling hand. The girl wondered what had happened between mother and daughter that they had to separate and cut off contact for several years. Elizabeth could learn the truth from only one person, so she went to him. "I've been waiting for you," Mary Adams exclaimed joyfully when she saw Elizabeth on the doorstep. "I wanted to come to you to ask you to breakfast." The woman didn't seem to be lying. Her table was indeed already set. Fragrant tea, luscious cakes, pancakes, and cottage cheese. Mary Adams must have gotten up very early to prepare a treat for her new acquaintance. Elizabeth even blushed with embarrassment. "Why do you trouble yourself so much?" Elizabeth was modest. "I'm so embarrassed that I barged into your life." "I'm only glad you did," Mary Adams replied animatedly. "I'm all alone with no grandchildren or children. My neighbor left me. It's good to have you here. I feel sorry for you, though. It's not good for you at all." Mary, a little embarrassed by the last sentence, remembered how Elizabeth had cried the day before and worried that she had lost everything she had. But Elizabeth was not offended. On the contrary, she even smiled. "By the way, I wanted to ask you about your previous neighbor." Elizabeth remembered, sitting down at the table, and the dishes gave off such an appetizing aroma that she wanted to start breakfast as soon as possible. Lucy lived in that house. Immediately the memories rushed back to her mind. Mary Adams was a good womankind. She hadn't been gone that long, not even a year. Lucy and her daughter were unlucky. Did they fight a lot? A lot. "That's interesting to me," Elizabeth said and put the note on the table. Mary put on her glasses, picked up the letter, ran her eyes over it quickly. After reading it, she put her glasses back on the table and looked out the window. She seemed to have tears in her eyes as well. Because of such foolishness, frankly, they feared, Mary said after a long pause. Elizabeth had already managed to whip up a couple of pancakes in the meantime. Catherine is Lucy's daughter. She found a young man in town who wasn't young at all and was about 15 years older, probably, but rich. Lucy did not accept such a son-in-law. They called her daughter all sorts of names, but she and her fiancé had come to visit together. That was the last time Catherine visited her mother, and she told her not to show her face here. Elizabeth set aside the pies and pancakes, listened intently to the story. The girl had lost her mother early. She couldn't imagine how one could choose a groom between a fiancé and a family member. Elizabeth could not condemn either mother or daughter. It seemed to her that a compromise should have been made, but it was easy to reason when the situation didn't concern you. Anyway, after a few months, Lucy regretted everything she'd said. The daughter did not answer the phone and did not come to visit, finished the story Mary Adams. And then Lucy decided to move to the city. Hoped that at least there she will have the opportunity to meet with her daughter. But where Catherine went, she didn't know. So now I don't know if they ever met. "Somehow I'm dying to know," Elizabeth said suddenly. "I have the address. I'll go and ask. And at the same time I'll confess that I've taken over her house." Elizabeth was telling the truth. The thought occurred to her as soon as she read the letter. She wanted to hug the poor woman and feel sorry for her. But she didn't have enough money for the journey. The town was farther away from the village than the one Elizabeth lived in. Therefore, the ticket would cost more. But Mary Adams offered to help her again. Elizabeth was embarrassed, but she would not refuse. The girl was still sure that she would not be in this predicament forever. One day she would have the opportunity to pay back everyone who was helping her. Elizabeth went to Lucy's the next morning. She was ready to go earlier, but the bus left only once a day in the early morning. The girl wondered on the way what she would say to the woman, why she had even considered this trip. But the bus was already pulling up to the train station. It was too late to change her mind. It took Elizabeth about 2 hours to find the right address, and now she stood in front of the door to Lucy's apartment. She tentatively pressed the bell, but it didn't work. Elizabeth already thought that this was a sign that she should go back to the village and continue to think about her own problems, and not solve other people's. But no, she hadn't come all this way just to be scared and come back with nothing. Elizabeth still didn't know why she had come here in the first place or what she would say. But she knocked on the door. No one opened, though Elizabeth knocked several times, and for quite a while. She even thought she heard footsteps outside the door, but no one ever opened. Just as Elizabeth turned around, there was a thud in the apartment, as if something or someone had fallen. There was no doubt about it, the sound came from behind the door behind her. Elizabeth couldn't leave, so she risked opening the door to see if anything was wrong in the apartment and if she needed help. The knob came down and the lock opened. Elizabeth pushed the door open and immediately saw a woman on the floor in the hallway. She seemed to be having a stroke. The girl was frightened. She didn't even have a cell phone to call an ambulance. But Lucy pointed to the kitchen. Elizabeth immediately went where the woman showed her and saw a smartphone on the table. The ambulance came 10 minutes later. Elizabeth went with Lucy to the hospital, spent about an hour in the corridor until the doctor came out to her. "She's fine," the doctor said. "You called the paramedics just in time." Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief, and then the doctor said that they had already spoken to the patient's daughter. They told her that an unknown girl had come to the hospital. Catherine said she'd be here within the hour. She asked you to wait for her, the doctor said. "I'll wait for her," the doctor said. "I'll wait for her," Elizabeth replied calmly. She had nowhere to be in a hurry. She thought it would be a great opportunity to reconcile mother and daughter. She was even glad that Katie had decided to come after all. She didn't ignore her mother's problems. So it wasn't too late. Katie arrived quickly, less than an hour later. She ran straight to Elizabeth and knelt down in front of her. "Don't be. That's what anyone in my position would do," Elizabeth said, embarrassed. "The doctor said you saved Mom's life," Katie said, getting up from her knees. "I don't know who you are or how you know my mom, but I'm grateful to you. Ask for anything you want." "Come on, I don't need anything. Will you forgive your mother?" Elizabeth said, and handed her the letter she had found in the house. "I didn't go to your mother's house of my own free will. There was this note. It was meant for you, I take it?" Catherine took the sheet, read her mother's message, which had been waiting for almost a year in her home. She couldn't hold back her tears as she read the words written in neat handwriting. Elizabeth noticed the look of guilt, shame, and unspeakable pain in Katie's eyes. "How could I have forgotten about her?" "She could have died alone," Katie said, sinking down on the bench beside Elizabeth. "But how did you end up in her house and apartment?" The doctor reported that Mama had been taken from the city apartment, not the village. Elizabeth was ashamed to admit that she had moved into Lucy's house without her knowledge. But she saw Kathy as a good and kind person who would certainly not judge her. So Elizabeth decided to tell her the whole story from the beginning, so that Katie would have no more questions for her. "It was an accident of fate," Catherine said when Elizabeth had finished her story. "Stay the night at your mother's in the village. You can't leave tonight anyway, and she will be in the hospital for weeks. Tomorrow morning I will come to visit you and we will talk." Elizabeth thanked the kind girl. She really hadn't thought at all about where she would stay. The buses traveled once a day, not only to the city but also from the city. So she could either walk to the village, which would take her a long time, or take a cab, which Elizabeth simply didn't have the money for. Catherine not only allowed her mother's savior to stay with her, but drove her to the familiar driveway. "I'll be there at 9, Katie said goodbye. "I hope you won't be asleep by then." Elizabeth re-entered the apartment she had been in for only a few minutes. She found it cozy, but everything about it suggested that it belonged to a lonely and deeply unhappy woman. There were many framed photographs on the shelves. Each picture was of Catherine at a different time in her life. On one was a baby, on another a first grader with puffy bows, on the third already a graduate in a beautiful ball gown. Lucy loved her daughter and missed her in a strange apartment. It wasn't easy for Elizabeth to get comfortable. She had to get used to the idea that she had no corner of her own now. The girl thought a lot about Catherine, what she wanted to talk to her about, but there was no point in guessing. The only thing left to do was to wait until morning to see if Catherine had been deceived. Catherine knocked on the door at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Elizabeth was surprised that the girl knocked. She was not the mistress of the house, so Catherine could have entered her house unannounced. but Elizabeth even asked permission to enter and clarified exactly where they could set up to talk. "Mother is feeling better and would like to thank you," Catherine said as she sat down at the table in the kitchen. Elizabeth poured tea, but there was nothing else she could offer her guest. She even took the tea bag without asking. "If you don't mind, we'll go to the hospital after we talk," Catherine said. "Of course, I also have to thank your mother, after all, to get to know her. I'm her lodger." It turned out that Catherine was floundering, did not know how to get to what she wanted to talk about. Elizabeth guessed that Lucy wasn't the topic of conversation. "I remember you telling me your story yesterday," Catherine began to say. "You were running a successful business, and I found some articles about you on the internet. It's amazing that a businesswoman like you could be so foolishly deceived." "I trusted both Ben and my husband," Elizabeth replied, feeling an inexplicable sense of guilt. "I was just intimidated and confused. They were people I didn't expect to be set up at all." "Don't think I'm trying to shame you or make fun of you," Catherine said, as she realized that her words might have sounded like mockery. "Quite the opposite. I would like to discuss some details with you. I have a proposition for you that you'll like, especially given the position you're in." Elizabeth raised her head and squared her shoulders. Her whole appearance showed that she was ready to listen to the terms and offers. Catherine immediately saw in front of her a strong woman, a real businesswoman. Until then, Elizabeth seemed to her as a lost girl. But her ex-husband and assistant could not bury in her a confident businesswoman. "I wasn't, and I'll be honest about it," Catherine said. Before voicing her proposal, or even a request, Catherine told the backstory. She admitted that she married a man who was 18 years older than her. Mary Adams got it a little wrong, but she entered into marriage for love. Catherine also revealed that this was the reason why she and her mom had a fight. Elizabeth was silent about the fact that she was already aware that she was the cause of discord between mother and daughter. "2 months ago, my husband passed away," Catherine said sadly. "No sooner had I recovered from this loss, although not yet, to be honest, as I had to face a new problem: the heirs. Other than our mutual son, only 3 years old, my spouse had no children. His business has passed to me. But I don't understand anything about it. I am afraid that I too could be cheated by assistants and accountants and other employees. Anybody could set me up because I don't understand anything about the paperwork. So I would be very happy if you would become my right hand. Teach me how to run the business and help me get the company out. Because with me at the helm, my late husband's company is going downhill." Elizabeth was pleased that Catherine had decided to entrust her with such a responsible task, even knowing that she herself was dressed like a little girl. She even asked Catherine if she was embarrassed by that fact. "Not at all," Catherine replied calmly. "You've been running a successful business for several years. I read that you built your company from scratch. Why can't you promote an established and successful business? Personal motives played into your business. You were deceived by people close to you. I have a different situation. I'd be happy to help you." Elizabeth agreed. Catherine hugged her new acquaintance, thanked her for this answer, offered Elizabeth to immediately give an advance payment so that she could rent an apartment, settle in for the first time, buy food, new clothes. After the conversation, the girls went to Lucy's hospital, where the woman tearfully thanked Elizabeth for saving her life. But she was even more grateful for reconciling with her daughter. After her first day of work, which was Elizabeth's abbreviated day, she drove to the village. The purpose of the trip was one thing: to talk to Mary Adams, to settle her debts. Elizabeth couldn't even figure out what Mary Adams was happier about: the fact that her new neighbor had done well and found a job, or that Lucy had reconciled with her daughter. The woman did not want to accept money from Elizabeth, but she said she would be offended and would not forgive herself if Mary did not accept her debt. Elizabeth also wanted to visit the stall clerk, who was also kind to her. But she had to go to another town for that, not the one where she had settled. Now she didn't want to spend half a day on the bus, so Elizabeth decided that she would thank her when she bought a car. By the way, she was able to do so after 6 months. All in all, in the entire 6 months, Elizabeth had almost completely recovered from her collapse. She became not just an assistant and business consultant for Catherine, she became the second person in her company. The girls were able to not only save the business, but powerfully propel it forward. Catherine was well aware that without Elizabeth's help she could not have done it, and therefore generously thanked the girl with a high salary. Elizabeth had not lost her entrepreneurial spirit. She tried not to waste a lot of money. After she bought an apartment and a car, she started saving for her own business. It was not the first time she started from scratch. She'd already managed to start a business once and create a successful construction firm. So she would do it again. It took the girl 3 years to get back on her feet. She was still a long way from her previous fortune, but last time it had taken her years to get her business off the ground. Now, however, things were progressing much faster. Elizabeth did not forget Mary Adams and the saleswoman, who had been kind to her. She had paid off the second one too, and they had even managed to chat. The woman at the stall was named Tatiana, and she told her that she was deeply unhappy. Her own son had died in a hot spot, and she was all alone. Elizabeth had no idea how many lonely women there were in the world. She thought about the fact that there was no one to take care of them. For example, Mary Adams complained that she herself had to chop wood for the winter, shovel snow, go for water. It is not good for an old woman to do such hard labor. When Elizabeth had her own business and money, she thought about creating a foundation. The girl found volunteers who agreed to help old people and single women with hard physical labor on a free basis. The news of such a fund quickly spread around the city. Elizabeth was even interviewed for the regional channel. Christopher got up early to prepare for the meeting. The company wasn't doing as well as Elizabeth. He was nervous. The partners were refusing to cooperate. If at first no one cared who was at the helm of Elizabeth's company, after a while they realized that there was a difference. Christopher had never been a businessman, and things were not going well for him. He couldn't get organized on one level of his company. There was no way Ben could single-handedly pull the firm off the bottom, and so far they were still afloat. But the outlook for the next few years was bleak. Added to the fact that Christopher not only didn't know how to earn money, he spent it recklessly. And he had an assistant in the form of Sandy. This young beauty didn't worry about money at all. The money from her card, and consequently from Christopher's accounts, flew away like leaves from trees in the fall. Christopher had a habit of eating breakfast with the news. It was a habit he'd had since his days at the car service center. He brewed his coffee, set a plate of freshly cooked scrambled eggs in front of him, and turned up the volume on the TV. Just as he took the first sip of the aromatic, invigorating coffee, the drink immediately spurted out in a fountain onto the table. The thing was, he saw a familiar face on the TV. Elizabeth, in an expensive suit, beautifully styled and wearing expensive jewelry, was talking about her charitable foundation. She was definitely doing well. After the interview, the announcer talked about how Elizabeth is a successful entrepreneur and is already moving the local rich people from the top position. How is that possible? I ripped her off. Christopher said out loud, "If a man has brains, he is not lost in the world," said Sandy, who had just woken up to the smell of coffee. "That can't be said for you." Christopher was furious when he heard his lover's words. He reminded her that she wasn't exactly frugal either and had contributed significantly to their ruin. "I thought you were going to be a businessman," she said unashamedly. "Money is supposed to work and multiply itself, and for some reason you have only disadvantages. You should learn from your ex." The man could not stand such insults and obvious mockery from the girl, grabbed her by the hair and pushed her out into the street right in her pajamas. She shrieked, begging to be let go, but Christopher couldn't stop. She had hurt him too much with her remarks. Christopher was already thinking that his mistress had stopped seeing boundaries. More than once she had made insulting remarks about Christopher, especially if she didn't have enough money for new jewelry or dresses. Sandy could only demand and judge. It was impossible to get support and help from her. "Come to my place and get your sister out of here," Christopher told Ben over the phone. "What do you mean, take her away?" Ben didn't understand. "Literally, I don't need her anymore. I'm going back to my wife. And Sandy's standing outside the fence in her pajamas. And the longer you drive, the longer she'll have to walk down the street in God's pajamas." Christopher replied and hung up the phone. He wasn't joking or speaking in haste. He really intended to get Elizabeth back. He couldn't handle the business alone. The money would soon run out, and Elizabeth was obviously doing well. He thought that his ex-wife would immediately forgive him and take him back. All the more reason for him to return everything to her, provided she agreed to remarry him. Before leaving for another city, Christopher thought that Ben might harm him in some way. So he decided to fire the assistant and informed him about it by phone. "You realize that without me the end of your empire will come even faster." Ben answered him, who was also furious that his sister had been thrown out on the street like an unwanted kitten. "Don't worry, my ex-wife will fix my affairs," Christopher answered, starting the engine. "She would have fired you anyway. No one would want to work with a traitor." He hung up. Ben looked at his sister, who still couldn't get warm in the car. Did he seriously think Elizabeth would forgive him and welcome him back with open arms? Sandy asked through gritted teeth. "No, of course not. She's not stupid," Ben told her. "But we can try to gain her trust and punish the bastard." "What city does she live in now? Did you see it on the news?" Sandy nodded. Ben smiled and stepped on the gas. He and his sister are going to Elizabeth's place too. Just need to change their sister's clothes first. Ben decided that the mistress shouldn't be taken to see Elizabeth. She would be more able to confide in him without her. Sandy didn't insist. She didn't feel like traveling across town, but she advised her brother to call Elizabeth, because Christopher would definitely be there sooner. Elizabeth enjoyed the beautiful morning. Even though it was getting close to lunchtime, she'd given herself a chance to get some sleep that day. She and Catherine had had a party the night before to celebrate a successful transaction. The peaceful flow of the morning routine was broken by a phone call. Elizabeth had hoped to hear anyone but the man who had left her in the lurch a few years ago. "Ben?" Elizabeth said questioningly. "Did you get the wrong number?" "No. I want to warn you that another man from the past is coming to see you soon," the man said seriously, though his knees were trembling with excitement. "Your ex-husband has found out you're back on the horse and wants to suck on your income. Christopher himself couldn't replicate your success. He's almost out of money." Elizabeth replied that's what she thought. But Ben is worried for nothing. The girl would never forgive her ex-husband in her life, would never believe him. "I understand that." Unlike him, he laughed. "You want to get back at him, don't you? I have an idea." "I'm not surprised you have another plan to trick a man." Elizabeth's former assistant jabbed at him as well. "What I don't understand is, why would you want to do that? I mean, you two are kind of related, and even related." And Ben told him what Christopher had done to him and his sister. So he had a strong motive for revenge, too. Elizabeth still agreed to listen to his plan. She found his arguments convincing. Elizabeth was also attracted to the fact that this time her safety would not be threatened. So this wasn't another scheme to take everything away from her. Elizabeth was even looking forward to hearing from her ex-husband. There was no way Christopher could think of a way for him to show up. He wanted to make sure his ex-spouse didn't guess his intentions, as if he didn't know she was rich again. Christopher tracked Elizabeth down, finding out where she lived and worked. As if by chance, he found himself in the same establishment where Elizabeth got her coffee every morning. "What meeting?" Christopher exclaimed, meeting Elizabeth there. Yes, unexpected indeed, Elizabeth played along, who had long known that her husband was tracking her. The guards had already reported to her a few days ago that a man was following her. Christopher asked Elizabeth how she was doing, telling her that he was doing fine except for his love life. "Wow, your mistress only wanted money." Elizabeth ironically repeated after him. "Is this boomerang coming back to you?" "It's not true, I wasn't with you for money." Christopher answered her resentfully. "Ben and his little sister tricked me. She seduced me, and he put me up to it." Elizabeth nodded, looking understanding. It looked very exaggerated, and Christopher could see the obvious mockery on his ex-wife's part. Nevertheless, he was pleased that she did not stop talking to him, listened immediately, and even entered into a dialogue. All of this Elizabeth had done deliberately. She needed to gain his trust so that Christopher would think she had fallen for his bait again. And she succeeded. After the first meeting, Christopher was sure that after a couple more conversations and dates, he would be a rich woman's husband again. And Elizabeth was happy to play along. Each time she forced herself to communicate with her ex-husband, but she realized that without it, her revenge would not happen. She needed to feign trust and warmth toward a man she couldn't stand. Listening to Christopher's words was simply unbearable for her. She realized that he was a masterful liar, and believe her, he really wanted to deceive. Even though she knew that every word he said was a lie. Christopher was getting more and more turned on because he couldn't tell if Elizabeth trusted him or not. It seemed to him that everything was happening too easily. Immediately, his ex-wife agreed to a date, answered his phone instantly. Was she so starved for a relationship, so lonely that she forgave him so easily? Christopher went on the offensive, sending her gifts, arranging surprises, dates. He thought she was about to melt. Elizabeth stepped over herself when she went to these meetings and smiled sweetly at her traitor husband. She was even more disgusted when she saw Christopher cowering before her, the bastard squealing. "Ben, I'm getting tired of these meetings with my ex-husband. When do we move on to the next phase of the plan?" Elizabeth asked him after another date. "We need to push Christopher into action. Until he's ready to give it all back to you, we're not going to get anywhere," Ben told her. "How do you push him to do that? I'm already pretending to be in love and forgiving all the wrongs," Elizabeth clarified. Next to Elizabeth at that moment was Catherine. She came to visit her to discuss personal matters. The girls had become not only business partners, but also best friends. "I have an idea," Catherine said suddenly. Elizabeth immediately put the call on speaker so that Ben could hear her. Men are most afraid of competition. If Christopher found out that Elizabeth had a suitor for his heart, he would immediately move into decisive action. Ben agreed that it was a good idea. As a man, he confirmed it. Katie then informed him that she had a good acquaintance who would agree to help her. Christopher didn't know how to propose to Elizabeth himself. He still doubted that she had finally forgiven him. Suddenly, he received a call on his work phone. Since Ben had been fired, Christopher scheduled all negotiations and meetings by himself. He received a call from a man who introduced himself as a well-known investor, and Christopher knew his name. It was a man named David. This was a weighty figure in their field. Many people knew him, and everyone dreamed of working with this man. Christopher even straightened his back, although the person on the phone still couldn't see him. Christopher prepared for the meeting with the investor as carefully as for a date. Until the last moment, he didn't believe that the David he had in mind would come to the meeting. But his expectations were justified. After a short negotiation, the businessmen shook hands, but David was in no hurry to leave. "Is it true that Elizabeth Agorevna is your ex-wife?" David suddenly asked. Christopher nodded and immediately tensed. This question did not bode well. David said that a friend of his was interested in the woman. "He begged me to find out if Elizabeth had a boyfriend," David said, blushing. "I'm sorry to bring it up." "That's all right," Christopher coughed. "It's good of you to ask. Elizabeth and I are discussing the possibility of starting a family right now. I want to propose to her because our feelings are back." "That's too bad, because my friend was going to take her out tonight," David said. "But then I'll tell him he has nothing to look forward to." "Yes, please do." Christopher's voice became high, like a frightened boy's. Christopher waited until David left the restaurant and immediately called Elizabeth, asking her not to plan anything for the evening. He had a serious conversation to have. Wow, that worked so fast. Elizabeth was surprised. She knew at once that Christopher had prepared a serious conversation. He had dressed like a real groom, prepared a huge bouquet, and was very excited. Elizabeth sank into a chair and showed that she was ready to listen to him. Christopher pulled some papers out of his briefcase, got down on one knee, and handed Elizabeth the ring. "I want it all back," he said, to prove that he was serious. "I have prepared the documents that will give you everything back, everything that I took away. You will be my wife again." Elizabeth did not hurry to take the ring, open the folder with the documents, read them carefully, every line, every word. When she was sure that this time there was no deceit, she put her signature in the right places. "When did you have time to prepare them?" She was surprised. "But I was on my way to you with them," Christopher said. "You can see the date I wrote and signed them. It shows that I'm serious." While Elizabeth read the papers, Christopher remained on one knee with his arm outstretched. He was very worried. But since the girl signed the papers, then the deed is done. "It's a shame that you're giving me back much less than you took," Elizabeth began to say. and Christopher immediately realized that he was too happy too soon. And I gave you the company in a very different state of mind. But thank you for that. You can offer your ring to Sandy. I don't need anything else from you, if that's what it takes. I'll make a deal with the police, just like you did. I was wiser this time. Elizabeth took the folder with the documents, got up from the table and left the restaurant. Christopher remained sitting on one knee. He could not believe his ears. He now found himself in Elizabeth's shoes. She had tricked him too. A waiter approached Christopher, asking if he wanted to pay the bill. "What bill?" yelled at the kid, furious. "Didn't you see that? Didn't she just take everything from me? How am I supposed to pay for it?" The waiter was startled by this reaction, but kept his cool. He asked the man to calm down and told him that he would have to call security, and maybe even the police if Christopher didn't pull himself together and pay for his order. But he had no intention of calming down. Christopher was furious. He was realizing more and more every second that he had literally become a tramp. He threw all sorts of unflattering words at Elizabeth, who could no longer hear him. He started smashing everything, breaking chairs, tables, and sweeping dishes from the tables of other visitors. But he was quickly calmed down and tied up by the guards. "Christopher, why did you embarrass yourself like that?" "You are a respectable man," said the owner of the restaurant. While the bound Christopher and the staff waited for the police, the man's words echoed in Christopher's mind. He remembered how, years ago, he had asked Elizabeth to calm down and not embarrass herself by throwing her fists at him in the middle of the street. He could understand her pain now, her feelings. Only the girl was much more hurt and offended. She had been robbed of her hard-earned blood and sweat, and he had been robbed of something that had never belonged to him. It was cold and calculated revenge, and Christopher accepted defeat. He decided that now he would definitely settle down, go back to his car service. He could try on a rich life and realize that money doesn't just fall out of the sky. He had everything, but he couldn't save it. When Elizabeth walked out of the restaurant, she raised the folder above her head and shouted with joy. And in the car already waiting for her was Katie, who immediately ran out of the car, hugged her friend. The girls went to celebrate their victory in the club. On the way to the club, Elizabeth called Ben and told him that the deed was done. Christopher was left with nothing, and she got back all her own. The man was pleased with the outcome, even venturing to ask if Elizabeth would hire him again. "No, I've had enough of this once," Elizabeth laughed. "I am grateful for your help. I can send you some money to thank you and pay you for your work, for warning me, but you can't expect more than that. I'm sorry, once a man has betrayed you, you can't trust him." "Only enough talk," exclaimed a happy Katie. We were already at the club. Elizabeth said goodbye, hung up the phone, and looked at the huge building with its thousands of lights on. She had never been to such places, but her friend reassured her that it was a decent place and only rich people vacationed there. And there David was waiting for them. Elizabeth did not know about it. She did not even communicate with him. This Catherine agreed about everything with her friend, and the meeting at the club was organized by her at David's request. The man had long been interested in this young, successful businesswoman. He himself was also young and attractive, but had no success in his personal life. All the girls who literally hung around his neck did not seem worthy to him. Many needed money. Their behavior was not distinguished by modesty. And David wanted to find a decent girl, whom he would see as his future wife and mother of his children. Elizabeth seemed to him just like that, and he fell in love with her at first sight. David later admits to Elizabeth that he could hardly hold a conversation with her ex-husband. He disliked liars and cheaters so much, but when he looked at Christopher and realized that this man had caused a lot of pain to this beautiful girl, the urge to punch him in the face was self-inflicted. Catherine didn't bother to tell Elizabeth that David was actually interested in her friend. The girl wasn't sure if her buddy was ready for a relationship. She hadn't promised David anything except that she would introduce them. And the introduction was a success. Elizabeth was in a good mood, smiling, almost bouncing with happiness. And David just couldn't contain his smile as he watched such a happy and therefore even more beautiful Elizabeth. "I owe you one," Elizabeth said happily to David. "How did you manage to convince my ex-husband that I had a boyfriend and he signed everything back over to me the same day?" "Men don't like competition," David answered her with a smile. "But I wasn't lying about your suitor. I do have one. David blushed, but because of the darkness in the club, Elizabeth didn't notice it. The confident, successful man who runs a dozen businesses felt at that moment like a schoolboy shy of talking to a girl. Elizabeth danced and behaved casually, not even realizing that her interlocutor was burning with shame and shaking with embarrassment. Then introduce me to him. What if this is my destiny? Elizabeth laughed, who was in a great mood, and said it not seriously, more as a joke. But David literally blossomed before her eyes. When he heard these words, Elizabeth, he began to correct his jacket and hair, and then extended his hand to the girl. Elizabeth stopped dancing at this metamorphosis. She looked at David seriously, trying to determine whether she understood correctly what would happen next. Then let me introduce myself. I am the admirer, he said with contrived importance. It looked ridiculous again, because the man was terribly shy. He tried to give the impression of a serious man, but his excitement was getting in the way. Elizabeth was confused at this point, but she shook his hand. David was a handsome man, and outwardly Elizabeth was attracted to him. But the girl did not think about serious and non-serious relationships. It seemed to her that after her first marriage, she would remain a loner forever. Catherine watched from the side how her friend and old comrade communicate. She really wanted Elizabeth to find her happiness, and she knew for a fact that David was the perfect match. He would definitely not be with Elizabeth for the money. He is a loyal and decent man. Those were the arguments she made to her friend the next day. Elizabeth embarrassed. She too was well aware of what an important and powerful businessman David was. She couldn't believe she could be looked up to by a man of such high rank. And you're not an ordinary girl, either Katie told her. There's nothing to be surprised about. Give David a chance, you'll never meet anyone like him again. And Elizabeth heeded her friend's advice. She went on a few dates with David, accepted gifts and advances from him, and eventually they formed a beautiful couple. A year and a half later, Elizabeth and David became a family. Elizabeth did meet Christopher. It was unexpected. She had a flat tire somewhere on the outskirts of town, namely near a tire shop. Elizabeth even laughed that the owners of the tire shop had put something on the road just to get a customer. Never before had there been such an expensive car in this godforsaken place. Unfortunately, the owner's only employee was a half-drunk Christopher. Elizabeth recognized him immediately and said she wouldn't let him near the car. She called David and asked him to come and get her in the car. But while she waited for her husband, she decided to talk to Christopher. He told her without much enthusiasm that he had been working at the place since he was released from the police. After the debauch in the restaurant, he lived in a dormitory, and the only joy in his life was a bottle of vodka. Christopher watched with hatred and envy as Elizabeth got into David's car and they drove off to their happy life. To each his own, Christopher said, his voice hoarse with hangover. And we haven't lived rich. There's no reason to start. Jane was annoyed. She had a session coming up, a lot of debts to pay, not a dime to spare, and then there were the funerals. Her mother's neighbor, Aunt Clava, called and said that the funeral would be in a day. That's round-trip tickets, return tickets, and probably the cost of the arrangements if Danny or Victoria didn't take care of it. I wonder if they know yet, but to write to her brother or sister, pride wouldn't allow it. Jane decided not to go, not to spend and see the relatives with their sneers and complaints. She's studying anyway, so there's nothing for her to do there. She will come later and sit on the grave. There was no regret or longing on Jane's face. Rather, irritation with a touch of sadness from the disruption of the usual way of life. Her relationship with her mother, older brother and sister had been difficult all her life. Her mother molded her into a pretty girl, forbade her to go out and do what she liked, forced to learn lessons, help around the house, iron her school uniform from the evening. The forbidden fruit beckoned from this only stronger. She beat her stubborn daughter for her first cigarette and took away her phone when she saw her kissing a boy at the gate. Her brother called her a naughty girl, and her sister rolled her eyes and clucked her tongue. Eventually, at the age of 16, Jane, fighting with her mother over a bull, snapped and left home. She lived with a guy, finished school, then left with him 500 kilometers away in a large city. She worked for a long time, survived the breakup, but saved up for education, and only at the age of 23 she finally entered the university, when she realized the value and necessity of a diploma and an education. The girl did not maintain relations with any of her relatives. She had enough friends and colleagues. Rumors, of course, came what and how, but Jane purposefully did not look for them. Why? To be rebuked once again? No. Now, Jane did not want to sacrifice even a fraction of what she had worked hard and longed to achieve. She was studying, working, and it was unrealistic to find time for a trip, and she didn't want to be honest. They'll figure it out without me, the girl decided, and moved the outline closer. Her mother had failed to mold a decent girl out of Victoria. Unlike her straightforward younger sister, she had a cunning, dodgy character, went by the head, and was not afraid to use methods that others seemed dirty. So, without much connection or higher education, Victoria became the manager of a small travel agency by the age of 28 in the capital. She had a short haircut and generally looked very apathetic, with tattoos all over her arms, bright makeup and expressive after a visit to the beautician's face. The news of her mother's passing caught Victoria in another country when she had just checked into a hotel with a girl. The trip was a 10-day trip. As a calculating and practical lady, Victoria calculated how much it would cost to have an unplanned return flight and a missing voucher, not to mention a ruined vacation. The decision was obvious: stay and rest. Victoria could make it to her parents' funeral if she wished. She was in a good financial position, but principle intervened in the situation. Her son Keith say, "On management is not for women," her mother grumbled. "Manware business is to keep the home and hearth cozy, to keep the money. Let men earn money, it's their natural destiny. We have a different purpose." "What purpose, mother? We're not cogs in an engine. People choose what they want to be," Victoria argued. "Won't do you any good if you go against nature." Mother was adamant. "You've already gone and painted pictures, and it's time to think about your family." Victoria, in her favorite manner, rolled her eyes and sat down. Talking about family, husband, and children had been gagging her since she was in transition. Her mother's old believership pissed her off more than anything else. Inculcating humility and submission ended with the girl doing the opposite. She cut her dresses with scissors, put on jeans and aggressive outfits. Instead of cooking dishes, she chose sketches of future tattoos. Instead of romances for the sake of bouquets and moonlighting, she looked for profitable acquaintances. She knew she wanted to lead, to decide, and to get out of that box of traditional values her mother had stubbornly shoved her into. Of course, by the time she was 28, her dream had come true. Chain of useful connections brought her to the owner of a travel agency. Victoria quickly got a job there, then had an affair with a man and made it so that he reissued the business to her. Behind left a broken life of the ex-wife, a pile of fired, unwanted female employees, and a pile of gossip. But the ambitious girl did not care. Liams are not judged. As they say, Victoria combined the leadership of the party and constant traveling. At home, she could not survive even cacti, not to mention husbands, children, and dogs. Her self-sufficient, egoistic Victoria loved unrequited only herself and did not want to sputter on anyone else. Postum quickly got rid of the suitor. To take his business was very easy from a legal point of view. Victoria visited her mother's house once a year, or even less often. She was bored at her parents' house. There was no way to manage. Danny was the only one who could hold a horde of kids at attention when his visits overlapped with Victoria's. Jane ran off with her boyfriend. That left the arguments with his mother, which was nothing new from year to year. To Barbara's chagrin, Helga began to drink and complain about her health. Victoria was eager to get out of her father's house as soon as possible, so as not to cross paths and not to listen to the old woman's complaints. Brother will sort it out himself. He's a man, and he's the eldest, decided the apathetic travel agency boss about the news. She should have gone there a long time ago. God forgive her, and she thought, a little later, but did not say it aloud so that her girlfriend would not hear. If Helga tried to make real women out of her daughters, then she brought up a real man in her son. But again, everything turned out to be a mess. Danny from a small age was forced almost everywhere to solve his own problems, to stand up for himself, and not to roar. If Victoria and Jane Mother was poor with standard feminine admonitions, then from her son she demanded firmness, hardness of character, stubbornness, and determination. This eventually bore fruit. Danny was indeed a leader in the class, the head of the class in the first in studies. But in the shadow of achievements hid callousness of heart, despotism, narcissistic style of behavior, indifference to other people's problems. He could make caustic jokes about ugly classmates who secretly counted on his interested look. Might have snarled at his sisters and his mother herself. Jane all childhood hid from her brother in corners when he came home in bad spirits. Did not understand before her other people's tears because of a bad grade or worldly injustice. After school, the guy went into the army and decided to become a military man for good for status and benefits. He married a shy girl from the backwoods, made a child, and by the age of 33 moved with his family to the seacoast. We could only guess what was going on at home with Danny, because his wife did not dare to say a word against him. Only a shadow in a dress looked out from behind her husband's back. It was clear that he cheated on his wife, and in general felt his complete impunity. Danny came home mostly because of some paperwork issues. He knew that his mother had started to drink, but he limited himself to rare duty calls and sending money with the words, "Go to the doctor." He regarded Victoria as a fallen woman, Jane, an outright fool and a loser, and always set himself as an example to them without listening to any arguments. As a result, when all of them were almost separated, communication was reduced first to drying the walls of the house, then to short texts on holidays, and later and completely hushed up, and everyone was satisfied with everything. The neighbor's call came at breakfast. Danny listened to the news with a stony face. He pondered what to do. The death of a relative is a valid reason, and it was certainly possible to leave the service. But first of all, it was a long way to go by airplane. Secondly, he had long ago had no warm ties with his sisters or his mother, only actual blood relation. He hadn't been back home in 2 years and hadn't bothered at all, and here was a funeral or something akin to longing pricked Danny's heart. But it quickly faded. "Will you fly?" Shyly asked his wife, serving coffee. "No, I'll send money. They will organize themselves there." "Gee," said the man. "No. What about the inheritance?" The wife asked again. Danny suddenly thought about it. "You're right, but we don't know if my mother left a will, and if not, then we already get the house for 3. According to the law, we don't have to break down either. Nowadays, such cases can be solved from a distance." Violet was standing by the fresh pit with a young girl at her side. Besides them, there were about 10 other people at the funeral. Neighbors, friends, and former colleagues of the deceased. They never showed up. Aunt Clava blotted her eyes with a handkerchief and adjusted the black mourning bandage on her head. "Oh, it's not Christian for children not to say goodbye to their mother. We can't make them." The girl sighed, clutching the carnations in her hand. "You're right, Barbara, you're right. Helga brought them up. She put her whole soul into it. But the children have grown up so ungrateful," Violetta complained. "Maybe at least they will visit the grave." At the modest wake, there were many kind words and tears. But not a single person asked Violetta and Barbara why none of the deceased's children were there, and they wouldn't have known what to answer since they had personally called everyone. Or rather, Barbara knew, but she had been too reverent of Helga during her lifetime and too respectful of her memory after her death to explain to each of his residents exactly what the matter was. "Actually, and why are you crying, tell me?" Seriously, Helga looked at her son's red face. The boy rubbed his eyes with his fist and pointed to the sandbox where another boy, a juvenile bully, was having fun with his blue brand new toy truck. "And hide to you, and you're crying. You have to be a man," Helga reprimanded his son. "You'll always be like this. You'll always walk around." Danny sobbed and looked at the offender. "We're saying don't hit first, but if you get hit, hit back." His mother admonished him, "Don't give yours back unless you've been asked," and said, "Please first." Dane sat down on the bench and his 6-year-old brain digested his mother's words. Helga watched the child but was in no hurry to return her son's toy herself. After a couple minutes, Danny stood up, walked over to the sandbox. "Thanks to me back my car, please," he asked the offender. The bully threw sand at Danny instead of answering. The boy at the same moment pounced on Nikita and firmly sealed Barbara on the back of his head with a plastic spatula. Soon a siren sounded again from the sandbox, but from a different source. A crumpled Danny in dirty shorts was proudly carrying the blue truck home. That day he realized something. That brute force works better than the word plea. At the time, his father was still living with him and was also doing his part in raising their first child. He forbade to impose on his son female duties and household chores. Said that a man should learn to earn and fight. Pots to wash and iron the laundry will be his wife. As a result, the boy didn't know how to make a bed or fry scrambled eggs at the age of 9. But he quickly realized his superiority over girls, and with this position entered adulthood. His father had an accident and died when Danny was 13, Victoria was 8, and Lil Jane had just turned 2. Max was a quiet tyrant and demanded total obedience from the whole family. Helga wanted her son to respect women and be strong in spirit, but the bad influence of his father had already taken root in the boy's subconscious. A blatant sound of broken dishes in the sink pulled Olga out of the pit after a night's work as a cook. She heard the noise and scolding from the kitchen. "Clean up your own maid." "No," shouted Victoria Yi, pointing her finger at a dirty plate on the table. "That's your job." Danny shrugged and indifferently dropped the dishes on the floor. "Stop it, Yi," Helga shouted at both of them. "They've Victoria. Is it hard for you to clean up and help your brother?" "I'm not a maid to clean up after everyone." The scandalized 10-year-old put her fists at her sides. "He has exams, he's studying, he's tired." "Well, what are you, like a little girl?" She silently picked up a plate from the floor, cleared a second one off the table, cleaned everything up, and turned around. Danny had left the kitchen with a triumphant expression on his face. Victoria breathed noisily, her nostrils flaring wide. "Daughter, you're smarter, you should be softer, more flexible." Putting a hand on her shoulder, Helga said, "I don't want to," Victoria objected. "I don't want to be like you." She stamped her feet and fled to her room, struggling to provide for the children after her husband's death. Helga worked very hard, took more shifts, hadn't been on vacation in years, and still had her own business and garden at home. No personal life, no hobbies, no hobbies. Helga lived for her children and the desire to give them the best. Education, summer camp, clothes, goodies, toys. She bought something for herself when the previous thing wore to holes and tore. One day a woman was getting ready to go to a parent-teacher conference for her son's 11th grade class. Danny looked at his mother. Stompy shoes, a stretchy skirt with an old oil stain, a blouse, and a late 90s fashion jacket. The boy wrinkled his nose. "Don't go. I'll say you've been working." He stopped the woman who was about to leave. "Me. Why, son?" Helga is perplexed. "They'll think we're beggars." "Shall we?" Danny replied briefly. "Don't embarrass me, Mom." The woman froze on the doorstep. She had barely gotten off work to hear about her son's progress from the teacher's mouths. Helga turned to the narrow mirror on the exit and glanced at her own reflection. In front of her stood a tired, unpleasant lady with bags under her eyes. "Go get some red." Danny took his mother by the elbow. "Nah, I'm not an underachiever. They won't scold me for sure." "But you know," and Helga returned to the room and tears came to her eyes. When Danny left for the army, Victoria was 14 years old. She had hoped her daughters would become her helpers, but the exact opposite had happened. Victoria's transitional age began to appear early, but very clearly. It was immediately clear that her father's genes had left their mark, and here the hysterical girl closed the door on any occasion, roared, and waved her face at her mother's attempts to impute some kind of morality to her. But among her girlfriends and friends, Victoria enjoyed authority and unquestionable power. She was able to expel or punish those she did not like. "You can't do that, my daughter." Helga sighed when she listened to Victoria's boastful stories. "You'll make enemies." "Ah, yes," replied the girl. "You can't do that." "Icon, Deki. Your husband too will be so tormented, and so will run away after a week." "Yes." Shook her head, woman. "Who said I'd even have one?" Victoria folded her arms across her chest. "I'd say," Helga splayed her hands, "and a family. Sooner or later you'll want warmth, comfort, children to nurse." "Gross. I've seen enough of you. Thank you, don't. There are more interesting things in life than washing and feeding a baby." The conversation was over. Helga had asked herself many times why the children had grown up to be opposites, instead of what she had raised them to be. Instead of love, understanding, and respect in everyone, Helga saw selfishness and self-purpose. Danny remained in the contract service and enrolled as a part-time student at the university to qualify for an officer's rank in the future. He hardly ever called, and when he picked up the phone, he waved off that he didn't have time to talk. By the end of high school, Victoria was more concerned with her own appearance than with grades and exam preparation. She worked part-time at different places to get tattoos and fashionable haircuts. Helga did not know about the first for a long time. The second accepted with a stretch, calming herself with the fact that hair is not teeth and grows. And the pictures on her daughter's body she saw when it was already late. A piece of tattoo popped out from under the sleeve of her t-shirt. "Can you see them?" Victoria asked, watching her mother stare in horror at her arm. "Would you like to see the whole thing?" The girl took off part of her t-shirt. A fiery dragon in mottled colors and bright spots looked at Helga. "No, why? Why? Tell me." The woman sat down frustratedly on a stool. "My EDTH. I wanted it that way." Victoria shrugged her shoulders. "You like it?" "It's not right. You'll be seen as a slutty woman. A decent guy doesn't need a painted girl." "Mom, when you were a child, tattoos were only done in prison and by girls of easy virtue. In your youth, you had to go to school, get married, and have a baby. In your picture of the world, girls wear dresses and boys wear pants. I'm so sick of your lectures." She threw the dirty rag used to wipe the table at the wall and ran back to her room. And in the evening, Victoria ostentatiously dumped her shredded skirts and dresses on the carpet in front of her mother. "Hey, you can't make me wear this now, no matter how much you want to." She angrily kicked the pile of rags into the oven with her feet. Helga didn't argue anymore. She only hastily wiped away a tear when she saw on the pile of rags the blue dress she had bought for her daughter's graduation. Once in a while, Helga was visited by her neighbor Violetta, a vivacious grandmother who also raised 2 children on her own, tended the vegetable garden every season, and kept poultry. Victoria treated Violetta's aunt indulgently. She could treat her aunt to jam. She did not interrogate or teach her. Jane often played with the neighbor's grandchildren and took her well.
"You're looking a little gaunt, Helga. It's time for you to quit this kitchen," Aunt Clava said, stirring her tea with a spoon in her mug.
"So where would you quit?" Helga waved her off. "What are the helpers for? Here, there are 2 growing up." Violetta nodded at the pictures of the girls in frames on the wall. Helga twirled a mug in her hands and gazed at the floating teas. "Clava, I think my children don't like me." She exhaled. "What am I doing wrong?" "Oh, come on." Aunt Violetta waved her hands. "All children love their parents, and yours do too. You do so much for them. A child's individuality should be embraced. His view of the world to encourage, to guide, only a little to support, and how to accept if they break their future life." In her heart, Helga banged her fist on the table so that she spilled the tea. "But it's their life, and you can't protect them from all mistakes." Violetta calmed her down, helping her to wipe puddles from her knee. "The world is changing, and they are changing. You teach them to accept it, but what do? Helga suddenly froze. The neighbor's words poked her in the soul, but it was impossible to admit it. The woman tried to be a caring mother from the position that she herself had seen in her childhood and that she thought was right. "I have 2 boys. Violetta sat back down. "So what do you think? They drank and smoked when they were young and went out and brought bad grades home. But now they're both handsome, both family men. They bring their grandchildren to me on weekends. Real men have grown up." The neighbor clapped her palm on the tablecloth. "I scolded them, of course, in a good way, but I left the right to make mistakes." The woman continued. If you insulted your friends, you'd get a slap on the neck from them. That's how it's brought up. Only on their own skin they understand. I can't do that." Helga shook her head. Her neighbor took her hand conciliatingly. "And even if you can't, the main thing is that you love them and want the best for them. They'll grow up. They'll understand later. And now let them be sarcastic. Don't take it to heart. Be above the childish antics. They need to prove themselves, spread their tails. Let them." Helga remembered her daughter's tattoo, her son's capriciousness and coldness, and could not understand how one could calmly react to such an attitude from close people. Although it was exactly what the kind-hearted neighbor insisted on. A paradox, no other way. Victoria went to the capital with some Mexican, having drunk her mother's blood at the age of 18. She didn't want to study, but finished some courses in management and administration. Helga had many conversations with her daughter about the necessity of a normal education, but everything was as if she were talking against the wall. Victoria had a different opinion and stubbornly continued to tear down the standardized female image. Jane was growing up too, and at first Helga thought she was a sweet and docile child. She wasn't soulless and narcissistic like her brother. She wasn't selfish and self-centered like her sister. She helped around the house, even though she was reluctant to cook and clean. But since she was 14 years old, she had been thinking only about partying and boys. She often skipped school, went on dates, and hung around with one suitor and another. Teachers called Helga with interrogations and requests to influence her daughter, to no avail. Once Jane long tolerated the moralizing mother and then issued in Simon, I want to have fun. It's time for books to go moldy. Helga was shocked by this statement. While Danny and Victoria at least had goals and desires, albeit not quite up to the gold standard, Jane was close to going down a crooked path, and so it happened. One day, Helga found her daughter's pack of cigarettes in a secret pocket of her jacket. Then she burst into her room and yanked Jane right out from under the covers, sleepy. "You're smoking?" yelled Helga at her. "I don't need an ashtray at home." She grabbed her bag strap from her chair and slapped her defensive daughter on the back with it. Helga had never hit a child, except when she was a kid. She might have spanked them lightly. But here it was as if she had snapped, as if in that blow she had unleashed all her anger for the three of them on one. Helga felt a lot of anger at herself for that outburst. Her son's words about Jane, who had been a troublemaker, kept going through her mind. Then Jane didn't speak to her for 4 days. She didn't stop smoking, but she hid it better out of spite. She also stopped doing things around the house, also out of spite. She had a tomboy in her company, an 11th grader and a handsome boy of the breed that drives girls under 20 crazy. Jane was no exception and went into the affair headfirst. Michael studied poorly, but secretly drove her in her dad's car. At night taught her to pour beer without foam and always talked about some murky business with guys. Jane was impressed and dreamed of running away with her lover to the end of the world. So, in the evening, her mother caught them kissing in front of the house on her way home from work. Michael and his family Helga knew perfectly well, barely earning a living anywhere. Father a drinker and mother a gossip. She elbowed Jane right out of her Bio's arms. "Mom, why are you always bothering me?" The daughter flared up. "You should be studying, not cuddling in corners with that bum," Helga said angrily. "I'll deal with it myself. You haven't lived your life. Let others live theirs. You'll figure it out. You'll be a walking wench." Helga felt that her voice was breaking into a croak, and her face was burning with anger and helplessness. How could anyone accept such a thing? How could one accept the deliberate desecration of one's own child's life? Helga didn't understand. Jane wanted to say something but froze. The scandal ended when Helga didn't find her daughter's things at home. Then she called her, wrote to her, asked her to come back, asked her to come to her senses. But Jane said briefly that she now lived on her own and did not need her mother, who considered her a walking wench. So the woman was left alone in the big house. And the other will say that live and be happy, offspring off the neck, but not Helga. No matter how the children treated her, it was harder to come to empty rooms. She called both Danny and Victoria, but they did not like to talk for a long time, citing their busyness. They also came rarely, and not for long. Aunt Violetta came in frequently and somehow brightened the loneliness of her mother. Helga even got a cat to keep her from being bored, but she could only listen and meow back. Soon the long work on her feet and her age, 55 years old, made themselves felt. At the examination, the woman was informed about a whole bunch of problems. Varicose veins, cardiovascular diseases, joints. Gradually, Helga herself did not notice how she began to drink alcohol to brighten loneliness and drown out sad thoughts. Aunt Clava came to Helga's house and found her asleep in the kitchen at the table. The woman roused her. Lately, Violetta was very worried about her neighbor's condition. She had become unsociable and cried all the time. Even the house began to fall into disrepair. Clava tried to visit more often, but she couldn't sit with Helga without staying with her. She was in her 70s. She jumped up, looking around, and then shamefully hiding the wine bottle behind the table. "You've had enough of living alone," Violetta said when Helga had cleaned herself up and was preparing breakfast. Who needs me? She waved me away. "Men look at young men, and I'm old already." Violetta smiled, though she meant something else. "Men are a matter of time," said the neighbor. "But I think you need an assistant and company." "My helpers are gone," Helga sighed, setting the coca down. One of Violetta's sons often supplied orphanages with things and other help from concerned compatriots. The orphans were supposed to be given apartments under a state program when they reached adulthood. But in practice, some waited years for them, and some did not get them at all. And you had to live somewhere. "There is a girl there, Barbara," Violetta said. "A pretty girl, but she didn't get an apartment. She gave birth to a baby at the age of 19. Now she is wandering wherever she can. You can't live in a shelter. And you know how hard it is with kids to earn money for a rented place. I feel sorry for the girl."
I still don't understand where you're going with this, neighbor.
Helga listened attentively. "I'm saying that you should take her in with you. You could help her with household chores and she wouldn't be bored. and you'll do a good deed. You won't have to work forever. And I'd get her a job as a nanny in a kindergarten," Violetta finished. She didn't like the prospect of letting a stranger with a child into her house. But on the other hand, Violetta was right. She was already going crazy with loneliness. It couldn't get any worse. Victoria looked irritably at the mud on her new shoes, the dirt of her hometown, where she'd fallen into when she'd barely gotten out of the cab. Sweet home, the girl muttered through gritted teeth. Victoria was not going to stay here for a long time. The next day, she already had a plane to the capital, and Barbara stayed in a hotel. She was preparing herself morally for the meeting with her relatives, her older brother and younger sister. After all, for the first time in many years, they were all to gather together in the notary's office for the announcement of her mother's will. The news of it came as a great surprise. Victoria had assumed that the house would go to the three of them in equal shares according to the law of inheritance, but not so. The girl was tormented by a bad feeling. The call with the news again took her by surprise during the return from vacation. Now there was no way to get out of it. Who knows what her mother, who was obsessed with correctness, would write in her will, and the very fact of its existence was a moderately pleasant surprise. There was nothing to do. I had to go back on board the airplane. It was not, after all, to leave all of her mother's possessions to her relatives. Victoria even thought over in her head how she could competently take away their parts of inheritance from her brother and sister. She even called familiar lawyers, who were frequent visitors in her travel agency, but they only shrugged their shoulders, saying that a closed will is a cat in a bag, and some schemes can be offered only after its announcement. The notary's office was located near the center and near the entrance. From afar, Victoria noticed a familiar figure with an army dressing. Quietly, she prepared to greet her brother. "Hi, you're still the same," she said as she approached him. "Hi, I can't say the same for you," Danny glared at his sister. He didn't like her haircut, nor the tattoos already on both arms peeking through the translucent blouse, nor the lemon-colored stiletto shoes and red pants. Victoria appreciated the look and rolled her eyes, but quickly regained her coolness and neutral expression. They exchanged short phrases about life, weather, and nature and waited for the last participant of the meeting. Surprisingly, there was almost no longing or sadness in the words of these people, only poorly concealed irritation at the need to disrupt the usual. No one even thought of going to the cemetery to say goodbye to the deceased. Probably mocking his younger sister was the only thing he and Danny had in common. Soon a cab pulled up in front of the office. A frazzled Jane jumped out of it in a hurry. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail, her crumpled t-shirt poking out of her jeans. "I guess you were right," Danny whispered in Victoria's ear, eyeing her relative contemptuously. "You're late to see," Victoria said, without greeting or ceremony to her younger sister's face. No, I nudged and Jane snapped back. "But it's not my fault the bus took so long." Victoria rolled her eyes again and pushed her bangs aside. "Pardon, Metty," Danny said in a whisper, already pulling open the door. "Have more important things to do right now." The notary, looking like a business canary, sat everyone down in chairs. "Well, first of all, my condolences for your loss. Losing a mother is a great blow." "I'm sorry," Danny cut him off. But we're busy people. We don't have much time." "We're busy people. We don't have much time." The notary nodded ceremoniously and asked for the testator's death certificate. Danny pulled the document out of his briefcase and handed it to him. The man ran his eyes over the papers, assured something, made a short note, and finally pulled an envelope out of his desk drawer. He showed his signature and the date on it. Then my mother must have felt it. The document was drawn up 6 months before she went to the next world, Victoria whispered, not addressing anyone in particular. The second envelope was also drawn up according to all the rules, with the signatures of 2 witnesses and the notary himself. In one of the signatures, Victoria recognized the hand of her neighbor Enclava.
The envelope was opened, and finally the necessary paper lay on the notary's desk. The deceased's will was written on an ordinary yellowed sheet of paper from an old notebook, which did not fit the office and the situation. While the notary read out the text, Victoria nervously tapped her fingernails on the phone screen. She was holding a candy wrapper in her hands, and Danny was crunching his knuckles. Everyone understood the importance of the moment and waited. The notary looked up at the audience and paused expressively.
"I bequeath all my property to Barbara Miller." There was such silence that a fly could be heard crawling on one of the folders on the far shelf. "Then furry take it there is no Miller here. The notary looked equally surprised at the young people, to which Victoria jumped up first from her chair. "Who the hell's Miller? What the hell kind of mess is going on with your people anyway?" She rushed to the table, wanting to see for herself if what she had heard was a mistake or a joke. But her mother's handwriting said exactly what she'd heard. None of the names that the 3 children Helga had put in the will, as the complex signature at the bottom with its many curlicues testified. Victoria remembered from high school trying to copy it in her diary and failing miserably each time. Per se, "We're not going to let it go." Danny threatened the notary, who also wanted a bigger piece of the inheritance. "Yeah, sue all you want." The notary shrugged it differently. "My case is done. Oh, and don't forget the copies." Under the puzzled, lost, somewhere angry looks of those present, he made 3 copies of the will, certified them, and handed them to everyone in turn. "I have a son growing up. He needs a place to live too." Danny emphasized the word, saying, "I need to invest in business. You'll earn a bed for your son yourself." "I don't have an apartment at all. I live on a rented one," Jane shouted, listening to her brother and sister squabble. Both of them stared at her with such eyes that it became clear. They were ready to get rid of the third applicant for the inheritance right here. Jane squeezed her head cowardly into her shoulders. The bickering under the door of the notary's office continued. Everyone realized that a quick resolution of the case would drag on for an incomprehensible period of time and incur costs and nerves. "Meet Barbara. And this is her son." Violetta introduced Helga to the girl standing modestly on the doorstep. She had a 1-year-old baby in her arms and a small plaid bag. She was poorly dressed, but she had a thick shoulder-length blonde braid and huge blue eyes that still held a certain childlike naivete and belief in miracles. Helga remembered how children had looked at her with those same eyes a long, long time ago. Clava nudged the hesitant girl into the room. When the guest had gone, the neighbor asked, "Helga, what are you like? As if you were not your own. You're a good girl. Have I ever deceived you?" It's good, Helga said. "But I'm not used to it. I need to look at it more closely." Helga looked at her for a couple of weeks. At first, the conversations between the new acquaintances were awkward. Violetta, as promised, immediately arranged for the girl to work in a kindergarten. This way, she could look after her baby and earn a little money. And the house barber did not manage much, only asked short questions about cleaning and other household trifles. The baby did not disturb her and was quite quiet. "The awkwardness is gone thanks to His Majesty, Chance. Not again back." Barbara said loudly as she opened the door. The landlady's shoes were in their place, but she herself could not be heard. She cautiously entered the room, put the cradle with her son on the armchair, and found Helga still napping on the floor next to her. Barbara rushed over to the woman and started to bring her to her senses. Helga opened her eyes and looked around awkwardly. She had promised herself every day for the past 6 months that she would never buy wine again, never lock herself in a room and drink, until the pang of emptiness was filled. But coming back from her shift, her feet carried her to the store and her gut demanded relaxation. Helga guessed that Violetta had insisted on Barbara's move and knew about her neighbor's addiction and was worried, and everyone also realized that Helga's children didn't care about her. They are busy with their own lives, and Mahum will put their mother in rehab for a little while. "Helga, what are you doing?" Barbara anxiously looked into the woman's eyes. "Your blood pressure, your heart isn't right. And you're drinking?" Helga tolerated it. The girl shamed her, justifiably though, and then the unexpected happened. The accumulated tension, longing, sadness overflowed the cup and tears spilled out. Helga buried herself in Barbara's chest and burst into tears. The girl fell into a stupor for a couple of seconds, and then embraced the woman and began to caress her back and comfort her as if she were a small child. "I've always dreamed of having a big family," the landlady said while Barbara poured tea. "I wanted to be a mom. I played mother-daughter all my childhood, read fairy tales about princesses. Mom did not allow to go out with boys, taught to be meek, malleable, soft, or told me to take care of myself or my husband. And I looked at them and my father and thought that I would also have a warm family atmosphere and respect, a hot dinner in the evenings at a big table. But our table was small, and the apartment was only 2 rooms. Helga sniffed her nose like a schoolgirl. Barbara put the cups on the table and sat down on a stool next to her, watching her son, who was beginning to fall asleep. "I always thought my husband was the pillar, the wall, but wise. That's how I lived until I met Max. I fell madly in love, but I didn't see who." Helga continued. I got pregnant with Danny, we got married, and then Max moved us here to this house. I realized I was in a fairy tale. The woman grinned and sipped from her mug. Not the fairy tale I'd read, though. I thought I was a princess, but it turned out to be Cinderella. You would know how much I crawled here on my knees, pregnant, cleaning the floors, windows, and mirrors every day. Free meals with my belly. First, second, and compote. Barbara listened without interrupting. My husband worked, got a good salary. We had enough. But he demanded perfect cleanliness and housekeeping. And I was happy to work like a horse. I loved hard. I caught rare moments of tenderness from him after reproaches for dirty tables or unpalatable cutlets. I thought it was my own fault. Then my son was born. I went into motherhood, began to raise myself. A troop. Plain bad things stick easier and faster. We all know that. And so instead of a good son grew a copy of her husband, who thought that a woman only should. Oh, his poor wife now. Poor girl. I'm so sorry for her. Helga sniffed her nose again and hastily took a napkin out of the napkin holder. It's not your fault. Barbara intervened gently. You did everything you could to make the child happy. Bad example and bad upbringing played a part. I wanted to raise my son to be a noble, kind, and just man like his grandfather, Helga explained with a sigh. It's a shame he spent so little time with his grandson and left early. If only it had been otherwise, if only it had been. My love, care, and participation were taken for granted by my husband and later by my son. I realized this many years later. I didn't see my mistakes then and made the same mistakes with my daughters. Albert dozed ridiculously in the stroller with his arms spread out. Helga got up to cover the baby with a blanket. Barbara did not disturb her. When I got pregnant, my husband demanded that I contribute to the family budget. So I ran headlong into whatever job I could get. We're a family, although mentally, he ate me up every single day, and then I found out he was cheating. I cried to my mother, looking for support. She said that everyone is like that. Bear with it, the main thing is children. He'll go for a walk and come back. So I learned that not such a noble man was my own father. Just my mother was wise and did everything to make me see the perfect picture. It was already getting dark outside the window. A fine October rain began to cover the windows. A rooster was crowing loudly for some reason at the neighbor's house 2 houses away. Barbara wrapped the curtains and carefully took Albert into his room to put him to bed, promising that she would be back soon. When the new neighbor carefully tiptoed into the kitchen, Helga was already making tea for the second time. And I did a new stupid thing, the landlady continued. I forgave him, just like my mother said. Why, young naive? I was only 26 years old. Husband realized that he has full power over me and can, in Jane's situation, to remain unpunished. He scolded me for every speck of dust, for the laundry, for the kids' mess. And I obediently tolerated and only scolded myself, that bad hostess, bad mother, bad as a woman. And then the third pregnancy. I decided to leave, hoping for miracles once again. But no. My husband was stricter in bringing up the girls scolded for any disobedience, even the tiny Jane. And for some reason I pushed, clogged their heads with marriage, correctness, wise femininity. Oh, if only I had realized before, if only I had realized. Helga moved her eyes to the ceiling and blinked often, stopping the tears that came to her lashes. And when my husband crashed with his mistress, as I found out later, it was as if the rope around my neck had loosened. I wondered if I should be sad and cry. No. Even though I had to work harder, I was glad, but for now only Barbara, that no one else would come to my bed from under someone else's skirt. Barbara moved closer, lightly hugging Helga, whose shoulders were shaking. I wanted so much to raise sweet, affectionate girls, but with my compulsion I raised a selfish girl, and I realized my mistakes only when they all left. And I, aging, lonely, and none of them needed. Helga, don't be so nervous. Barbara's calm strokes on my back were soothing. All people make mistakes, but there are no mistakes that can't be corrected. You did what you knew how to do. You loved and cared for them as best you could and knew how. I'm sure it's worth talking to everyone and everything can still be saved. Oh, my dear, do you think I didn't try when consciousness overtook me? Helga sighed. I called, I wrote, I invited them to visit. They waved me off, said they were busy. The only thing I achieved was a couple of meetings with my grandson and money for medicines and I decided to go to myself, but they stopped me. I put up with it, tried to understand, tried to justify them, but I knew I was fooling myself. I was burning with this feeling of helplessness in front of those I had created. I broke down. Yes, I started drinking. It's the only way I can dull for a while the pain of not being needed by my children. You spent your whole life giving yourself and your joy to your husband, your children strangers. Have you ever been truly happy? Barbara asked cautiously. I don't remember. The woman was silent for a long time before answering. I was happy for my son's grades, for my husband's success, for the fact that the children ate well and didn't get sick. That's not it, Barbara said. Although, as a mom, I understand you, I am also happy when Albert eats and sleeps well, but this is different. When you were happy for yourself, were you inwardly, sincerely happy? This time Helga was silent for a long time, trying to search for such a long-forgotten feeling in her memory. And she found it only in childhood, when her mother brought her a small kitten from work. Helga played with it for a long time, cherished and stroked the animal. I think I have long forgotten what it is. She answered quietly. Many people forget, but it is very important to keep the ability to be happy at any age. Barbara smiled. Let's learn again. Me, come on. Surely the neighbor knows who this Barbara is, Victoria reasoned, sitting in the cab, once again cursing at the lack of asphalt and the dirt of her hometown. When the fervor for arguing at the notary's office wore off, the trio decided to go to Aunt A's house. She called with the sad news she was also a frequent visitor to her mother, and her signature was on the envelope with the will. Victoria, Jane, and Danny agreed that it was her they should ask first. There wasn't much time. Everyone had business to attend to in town. I wanted to resolve the difficulties as quickly as possible. But that was not the case. Not only that the situation became tense, but also periodic jokes and sarcastic clues to each other added fuel to the fire. They caught the neighbor at home. Victoria, without ceremony, was beating her fist right through the wicket, and Violetta came out. "Hello, hello." She greeted the unexpected guest in a childish way. And I've been waiting, wondering when you'll show up, you shameless people." "Violetta, let's not be moralistic." Victoria grumbled and tried to go through the gate. Aunt Clava put aside her club and threatened the girl. "You have no conscience at all for not coming to your mother's funeral. And you opened 2 wills, and then you came galloping in." The neighbor continued to reprimand the brother and sisters standing by the fence. "It's the law." Danny couldn't stand it and raised his voice. "You've grown up. You have epaulets on your shoulders, but you've never become a man." Danny opened his mouth in amazement. They remembered the neighbor's God's dandelion, who never said a rude word, brought them sweets and candies. "Let's put down what you think of us. Answer one question of ours and we will never see each other again," said Victoria. Suddenly, a girl peeked out of the kitchen window of a house which overlooked the wicket. "And Violetta, what's all the shouting? It's all right. Go and put Albert to bed." "I'll be right then," the neighbor replied. Victoria's eyebrows went up by themselves. Just a moment. But it was too late. Aunt Violetta slammed the wicket door shut with a vigor unprecedented for an elderly woman. There was a squeal from Jane, whose fingers had been nailed, followed immediately by Danny's swearing. Blanches with the company realized that no one else was going to talk to them here. Their mother's pig-headed attitude played its part. Victoria and Danny took some documents and things from their once home, and then all 3 of them left for their own cities. "Nah, here you go." Barbara, smiling radiantly, handed Helga a cotton candy on a stick. And the woman was so confused she looked at both of them on her day off. A small circus was performing in the local park, and Barbara, under the pretext of going for a walk with Albert, dragged Olga out to go there. Let's go, let's go." She jokingly hurried Helga, already on the threshold. In the last warm days of October, it is simply a crime to stay at home. The woman hesitated at first, but then she agreed. Helga caught herself thinking that it had been a long time since she had taken a walk like that, or her routes were calibrated for a specific purpose. Work, home, store, hospital. She had somehow forgotten that you could just wander aimlessly for fun, chatting with someone and not looking at your watch all the time. Huge maples were dropping a carpet of leaves on the sidewalk. Birch trees were swaying their soft branches, where, like a scattering of coins, the leaves were turning golden. The flower beds, late velvets and dahlias, bloomed with a shaggy pom-pom, and only the fir trees stood unperturbed in green patches among the October orange-red palette. Helga even admired the landscape, breathing in the still warm but already damp air soaked with autumn dampness. She remembered long-forgotten feelings of calm, joy, silent, quiet delight, when vanity seemed to be wiped away like dirt from glass. "Did you enjoy the performance?" Barbara asked. "Yes. I haven't been to a circus in probably 20 years, Weckl Guy admitted. Never thought I could go to a circus without a reason and without my children. Many things are fun to do without an occasion. Barbara supported her, fixing Albert's cap. Whoever said you need an occasion to have fun? Helga looked at her either with respect or with sudden insight. You know, Barbara, you're not at all what I thought you were, she admitted. The girl laughed. What did you expect? A sissy, but with a strong character. Well, not exactly. Helga faltered awkwardly. The question had stumped her. Barbara wiped the baby's applesauce-smeared hands, put him back in the stroller, and said, I went to the orphanage as an adult. At the age of 12, I already knew what it was to starve, what it was to hide from a drunken father in the basement. I learned to appreciate joyful moments. And in the shelter, she realized that if you cry all the time, you can go crazy. Helga listened eagerly to her companion. It was amazing how Barbara's appearance did not match her strong core inside. However, it was carefully hidden from prying eyes. And then I thought, why do we only rejoice on holidays? I mean, why do we do that? Gifts, surprises. Why are we trapped in this stereotype? Barbara continued. I started to break it as best I could. First, I made paper cranes for all the children in the orphanage, and then I figured out how to sew beautiful outfits from the things that were donated to us. We even organized a fashion show once. Helga laughed. She was surprised at how much fortitude and courage to appear different was in this fragile girl. I liked what I was doing, and I saw that joyful moments are very much needed all around, from small to great. The students reached out to me, and of course someone fell in love with me, Barbara sighed. It was a spontaneous feeling, an impulse inspired by my idea of joy in the midst of grayness. But now I have this bell. She patted Albert affectionately on the top of his head. But all is never well. She glanced meaningfully at Old Guy. And when I turned 18, I found myself with a baby outside the orphanage. They wanted to leave him there, but I didn't allow it. I didn't wait for an apartment and somehow rented a room in a communal house on my cleaning lady's salary and child allowance. That's how I fully realized how important it is to be happy that you just live and perhaps help others to live. Wait, did you go to work with children? Helga suddenly guessed. Yes, Barbara nodded. Children still know how to enjoy the little things. In adults, everything is drowned in routine, in some stereotypes and invented frameworks. We drive ourselves into a cage where there is nothing but vanity, problems, and fears. There are very few people who in adulthood can genuinely rejoice and see the beautiful things around them. She threw her scythe and pointed with her hand to a woodpecker on the trunk of one of the maples. Helga also noticed the red-backed bird, which was busily hopping along the bark. You have welcomed me into your home. You have been kind, and I want very much to help you enjoy life again. Barbara said, and you're starting to be good at it. Helga hugged the girl, hiding her wet eyes from her. It had been a month since that conversation in the kitchen that evening. Helga had forgotten the last time she'd had a drink. Her house felt cozy and bright again, in a way it probably never had been before. Maybe because both women needed this coziness and both tried to maintain it. Evenings were spent in conversation over fragrant tea or in walks. Barbara told Helga about everything. The woman was amazed at how broad the girl's horizons were and how much she had missed in her life. One day, the company wandered into the evening park again, and some guy gave both of them a rose. Helga was so embarrassed that she didn't know where to put the flower. She finally wanted to go home in the evening, cook something delicious, play with Albert, listen to Barbara. It was amazing how dear this girl, a stranger by blood, had become to her, and Klava sometimes came to visit and watched more and more how Helga had revitalized, how her cheeks were flushed and her eyes had the sense to live. It was as if Helga had gained a daughter and a grandson during this time, and there was no talk of rightness or marriage. How easy it turned out to be to accept a person with his special views and experience. And even if Barbara cooked soup differently, cut bread thickly, and washed floors the old-fashioned way, squatting, Helga no longer wanted to argue, to correct, to teach. And it was not indifferent humility, but the very acceptance she had always imposed on her daughters, imposing what she herself did not understand. One day at lunchtime, two men in overalls knocked on the gate of Helga's house. The landlady came out, looking behind the gate in surprise. Barbara was putting Albert down for his afternoon nap. Hello, we're with the utility. We're checking the wiring for meter connections. They introduced themselves and shoved some form under Helga's nose, which she didn't have time to look at. Everything is legal. She stretched out in confusion. If it's legal, we'll check the wear and tear of the wires. What if you have a leaky roof? The risk of fire due to a short circuit is important. One of the guests raised a finger and very determinedly put his foot in the yard. All right. The woman stepped aside, allowing the worker to pass. The repairman began to inspect the wires and their location, then looked at the pole with serious faces, scratched the back of their heads, wrinkled their brows, and as a result they said, "You have one wire here that is not connected to the meter." "Yeah, and the coating on it's worn off. We should cut it off and see if there's any sign of a short circuit." "I don't think there's any shorts. The TV works. The bulbs are intact." Helga shrugged. "You can tell the firemen the same thing later," one of the men told her indifferently. The woman had no choice but to let the workers into the house, and they started to make a lot of activity. They began to climb along the sockets, picking at the plafond, looking into the switchboard, studying how the wires were laid, and they didn't even take off their dirty shoes. Helga only sighed. 10 minutes later, one of the workers came to her again, and with a sorrowful face said, "Mistress, there was a leak in the ceiling near the switchboard, and the outlets are not grounded. You need to repair, or it will strike, especially in the rain, and that's it." He even made scary eyes to convince me. How can it be? How many years I've lived and everything is calm?" Helga only splashed out with her hands. "So many years you live, and it will happen tomorrow." Continued to scare her interlocutor. Suddenly, his partner came out of the corridor, and Barbara came out with a telephone in one hand and a heavy glass carafe in the other. "We don't need to change anything," she said sternly, shaking the chart. "We didn't call anyone. No. What are you doing, girl?" "We came to fix the malfunctions," waved his hands at the man in blue overalls. "Or troubleshooting that you just made up yourself. Get out of here, or do I call the police?" Barbara showed the dialed number on the screen. The men put their heads back into their shoulders and looked at each other apprehensively. Helga was dumbfounded, but her hand instinctively rested on the table, where the old ladle she had recently used to pour soup for lunch was nearby. These, so to speak, electricians came without tools, without papers, and with a piece of paper from the internet. Call and have them picked up. After these words, the men rushed out of the house, so much so that they almost took the door. Helga only had time to hear from the yard through the window, "You said it was a woman living alone." Dear, when her heart calmed down and her breathing became steady again, Helga was already sitting at the table waiting for Barbara to put a sedative in her glass. "How did you realize they had come?" she asked the girl. "I saw and heard from the window how you let them in, and I noticed at once that they came without tools. Electricians don't just walk around like that, and they won't come unless you call them." Barbara was watching the drops on the neck of the vial, and then one of them dropped the paper they were shoving in your face. And then it was clear. She set the glass in front of Helga, pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of her pocket. It was a crookedly scanned installation permit from 3 years ago. "Oh," the woman sighed. "What would I have done without you?" Obviously would have been left with no savings, that Barbara answered bluntly. "But everything turned out fine. But let's change the locks on the gate and the door. You never know." Lessons with the women became almost kin to each other. Barbara made friends from the young staff of the kindergarten. She sometimes asked Olga to babysit her son while she took time to go to the hairdressers or to buy some small things. Helga was only happy to take care of Albert. She even thought of him as her grandson. How different these happy moments were from the few miserable hours she was allowed to spend with her blood grandson. Danny and his wife were always criticizing her for everything and literally ripping the child out of her arms. It was different with Albert. He happily assembled with Helga colored pyramids of rings, threw cubes and balls, learned to walk, supported by a caring woman. Barbara sometimes came and watched from around the corner how reverently Helga treated her son. Everyone understood everything, and everyone needed it. One evening, the girl came into the kitchen to take the baby from the landlady and noticed a slight sadness on her face. "No. What's wrong?" Barbara asked worriedly. "My heart aches for my own children," Helga sighed. "I wish we could communicate with them the way we do with you, about everything in the world, at least on the phone. They haven't called or written to me in 6 months. Jane ignores me completely." Barbara thought about it. "I think you can try to mend your relationship with your children. It just takes patience. I've put up with an overbearing husband my whole life. I'm sure I have enough patience." Helga looked at the girl seriously, her to take the phone in her hands and write to her children. These thoughts caused a stupor in the woman and the fear of a new rejection of contact. It was so strange. She both wanted and feared it. And then Helga pushed the heavy thoughts out with an effort and began to remember the fall walk in the park and after the circus show. She imagined going there with Victoria or Jane. Finally, having tuned in enough, Helga dialed her eldest daughter's cell phone and, "Hello," Victoria's voice came through after a series of long beeps. "Hello, Victoria, ESC," Helga exhaled, gathering her strength. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine. Why are you calling?" Her daughter's voice became suspicious. "Do you want me to send money for the doctor or something?" "Hey, no, daughter. I just want to talk to you." "Well, you talk. I'm listening," agreed on the other end of the line. Something rustled in the phone. A knowledgeable person would have immediately realized that the call was put on speakerphone. "Victoria, you and I have never understood each other," Helga began. "It's probably my fault. I imposed what I was unhappy with without realizing it. Please forgive me, but now I realize my mistake and I want to know how you live and breathe. I want us to be able to talk like girlfriends and not hold a grudge. Are you okay with that?" There were clicks, distant mumbling, rustling. "Why are you talking to your girlfriends?" Victoria's voice came from somewhere, as if from far away. "Did Aunt Violetta come or what?" Then it became clear that the girl is settling some work issues on another phone. "Yes, we're chatting." Helga's lips quivered. "Bye, daughter." She pressed the cancel button and cried, covering her face. Barbara rushed to comfort the poor woman, but she sobbed like a wounded animal. "Oh, I'm an old fool." And Helga scolded herself through her sobs, hoping for a miracle. "Who needs me with my morals?" "I do. Let's try again." Helga looked at her dejectedly, smearing her tears. A little later. "Yes?" Barbara corrected herself, nodding cautiously. The disappointment and sadness left Olga alone only by evening. She realized that one attempt was not enough, that more would be needed, and already the first one had cut her soul with a knife. It was even scary to call Danny. He was the most callous and cold-blooded of all three. The woman didn't even know what words to choose for such an important conversation with her son. Only Barbara's closeness, her support, sincerity, and participation gave Helga strength and determination. Danny picked up the phone immediately. Unlike Victoria, his clear, service-trained flesh went through the house even from the tiny speaker. "Hello, son." Helga began. "I wanted to." "Mom." "Hurry up," Danny interrupted her irritably. "I've got things to do." "What's up?" Nothing. The woman let her eyes droop sadly. "I won't bother you then." "Yeah, go ahead," came from the other end. "We'll try again later. We can't give up." Barbara comfortingly took Helga's hands in the palm of her hand. The woman was no longer crying after the second call, but there was a look of detachment in her eyes. "Barbara, I don't think it's any use. They're adults, and they've gotten used to ignoring me so long ago that it's too late to re-educate them. And your youngest, Jane? She's a little older than me." Barbara wondered. "I don't know her contacts on," Olga said, embarrassed. "She blocked me everywhere after the fight. I only know that she lives in the city and is studying. Well, at least some channel of communication should have been left." Barbara wouldn't stop. Suddenly, Helga jumped up and, muttering something, hurried into the room. She rummaged through the dresser for a long time, then pulled out a dusty diary. Among the recipes, notes on how to properly wash cotton, and phone numbers, the woman found her daughter's email address. She had used this address once, in high school. How did I not remember before? "It's better than nothing," Barbara approved. "We'll think of something to write tonight. In the meantime, maybe we'll have ice cream." "Ice cream in December." Helga smiled. "Why not?" Barbara winked at her. "Who says you can't?" The mood would immediately become better. Just what the doctor ordered on such a gloomy day. With these words, the girl went to the freezer for a briquette of plombier. Helga watched. She realized that Barbara was trying her best to keep her spirits up, but her motherly heart would still ache. Even though she'd become like her own daughter, she couldn't undo the mistakes of the past alone. It's amazing how sometimes common troubles can draw even sworn enemies together and reconcile them. After returning to their respective towns, Victoria, Jane and Danny started a general chat room where they discussed their contested will. It took a couple weeks to figure out Barbara's identity and get the story from the outside. With a squeak, the company agreed to split the inheritance evenly between the three of them. Nevertheless, Victoria pestered the lawyer with inquiries about how to legally competent to pull off more. The poor boy was already regretting that he had tangled with her and mentally cursed all the gods who had once invented the court and inheritance. It's interesting, answered Danny, some left-handed wench with a child living on the dole. For a year, and she's had her mommy describe to her for it. What kind of a ride of unprecedented generosity is that? Like NK, I live like that too, and suddenly in a year or two with an apartment. Jane finished. Victoria clicked her pen irritably. The situation pissed her off. The world of tranquility, dimensionality, stable income, partying and vacations shook because of this idiotic will. Now by the efforts of her mom, it is necessary to fuss, spend money. Yes, relatives know how to put a pig under the door, she stretched under her breath. Communication with her brother and sister was annoying. Danny with the baby, Jane with the lack of a place to live. Barbara and Albert had gone to daycare, and Helga had just returned from a night shift as a cook. For weeks the woman had been plagued by vague premonitions. She had been thinking for a long time, deciding, calculating something in her mind, weighing it up, but Barbara had said nothing. With the woman, shuddered, thought it over a few more times, and went to her neighbor. "Violetta, I want to write a will," she blurted out, sitting down in front of her. "No, God be with you, Helga." Aunt Clava waved her hands. "Are you going to die?" "I have a premonition. I feel that I must do it now." When Aunt Clava stopped yapping about the neighbor's statement, she clarified. "No, I've been planning for a long time, but I think I'm doing the right thing." Well, so you need to call a notary if you're thinking about it." "Yes, without him the procedure can't be done." Helga confirmed. Most of the women called the notary's office and made an appointment. The notary said that 2 witnesses would be needed. "Don't tell Barbara, please," Helga asked her neighbor before leaving. So I thought we were going to use her as a second witness." The neighbor splashed her hands. Helga shook her head. We can't have her, Fada thought. Tay have a son coming in those days. Maybe him." Helga nodded in agreement, said goodbye to her neighbor, and went home with a slightly relieved heart. And the day before, she had spent a long time composing something else. An email to her youngest daughter, and had written a lot of pages. Using Barbara, she created herself a mailbox and slowly retyped the text onto the selection. It had been a week since it had been sent, but the inbox was just as sad and empty. Barbara had said that sooner or later her daughter would reply something, a single word. Helga tried to believe. She generally tried to notice more good things around her. It became an acute, daily necessity on the way to get rid of the colossal feelings of guilt and resentment towards herself, her children, and life. And at times Helga felt she was succeeding. In the polyotestria, in the gleam of the sun, in the warmth of a mug of fragrant tea passed from hand to hand, she gathered the grains of her medicine. And next to her was the one who always supported and protected the fragility of her recovering soul. Victoria enlisted all her connections and hired the best lawyer available to challenge her mother's will as soon as possible. It took several months, but the girl achieved her goal. The court confirmed that, as direct heirs of the first term, the native children of the deceased, the 3 of them, Victoria, Danny, and Jane, have legal rights to receive all the property of the mother. However, the second part of the plan could not be realized. The inheritance was awarded equally to each. And nothing. Victoria rubbed her hands together as she left the courtroom. "We'll do our own thing here. That's what the bossy travel agency boss used to do when legal methods were exhausted." Couple of conversations. Hit the right pain points. Intimidate, gather dirt. What difference does it make how she gets what she wants? Danny and Jane didn't show up at the trial. The former cited duty, the latter the cost to travel. Victoria alone represented the interests of the 3, although the interest here was rather entirely hers, and the relatives were notified of the entry into the inheritance by registered letters from the lawyer. He fought over the ways of action. How to force the fool's brother and sister to sell the mother's property as soon as possible so as to hide from them a part of the income from the transaction. Victoria's plans were Napoleonic. She had long yearned to open a second branch of the agency, to exchange her 1-bedroom for a 2-bedroom closer to the center and, of course, to go to the United States. Unfair division of money, unfavorable relatives. Victoria did not care. What was to say about a strange girl with a strange child? Neither Barbara nor Aunt Clava were present at the trial. The elderly woman and the young mother had no opportunity to go to the capital, although they knew what was going on. Barbara was stunned when she learned that Helga had left her all her property. The girl was very confused. She experienced 2 shocks in a month, first from Helga's death, then from her will. The woman passed away in her sleep. She had a heart attack. Barbara found her on her bed when she returned from work. It was 2 months after the will had been written. Helga sensed and was not wrong, unfortunately. Jane's soul was warmed by the news that Victoria had contested the will, and now the three of them were the rightful owners of the house, land, and garage. Jane was tempted to look for a cozy apartment in the suburbs. She was already dreaming about moving there, what kind of repairs she would make, what kind of sofa she would buy. All the farthest school folders of the laptop were dug through and through. Nothing could be found through the system search either. Jane was already nervous, imagining a sleepless night of preparing essays, but her memory obligingly suggested that she had sent her work to the teacher's mailbox in the 10th grade. She had to remember the password to a long, unused mailbox. After a lot of manipulation, Jane managed to log into the account. She began to scroll through her inbox with interest. Mostly they were advertising offers, letters from some sad scammers, archival photos with her classmates. Stop. What is it? Suddenly, a letter from an unfamiliar address caught Jane's eye. It was strikingly different from everything else that had accumulated in her email box for so many years. And the letter was not so old. It had been sent a little less than 8 months ago. My eyes ran along the lines, indifferently at first, but with each word I read, interest, anxiety, embarrassment, realization, and shame grew like a snowball. My daughter, how are you there? I don't know whether you will read my letter or not, but still I hope for the former. I want to ask your forgiveness for everything from beginning to end, for the upbringing you disagreed with, for my desire to mold you into a copy of myself and condemn you to the same torment, for not paying attention to your inner world, and for the abyss that separated us that evening at the courtyard, turning into years of silence and coldness. I hope you'll forgive me. I didn't realize my mistakes until years later. But I don't blame any of you three. You grew up to be who you grew up to be, and I'm still secretly proud of you all. But we've made so many mistakes. Resentments, misunderstandings, harshness, rudeness have divided us all as if we were strangers. How many of your happy moments I missed and didn't see, for which I now blame myself terribly. I wouldn't have dared to write to you, my daughter, if I hadn't had help. I met a girl who opened my eyes and showed me what I'd been depriving myself of all the years of your childhood. I finally have the strength to admit it. I realize I'm asking the impossible, but let's try to become just a little closer as family people. I hope with all my heart for a speedy reply. Your mom, Helga. Jane read out the letter. Her lips jumped, her shoulders shook. She threw herself back in her chair and burst into tears. These pure and sincere words of her mother burned out all the years of resentment from Jane's soul. That night, the girl did not sleep. She forgot about the essay, about her studies. She forgot that she had to go to her classes the next day. Jane sat on the floor of the room against the wall until morning, hugging a small plush toy she had brought from home many years ago. It had been given to her by her mother for September 1. The toy had been gathering dust under the couch in a bag for years. But today, Jane found it. At dawn, Plush was wet with tears, his eyes swollen. Barely a clock showed. Jane realized it was time, or rather, it was already time. She frantically flipped through the phone book, looking for Enclava's number. Having found it, the girl called the elderly woman, apologized repeatedly and with difficulty, but got Barbara's phone number from her. Her fingers twitched. Jane exhaled, hastily wiped a tear with the palm of her hand, and dialed the numbers. Hello, Barbara. You don't know me, but we need to talk. My name is Jane. I am Helga's youngest daughter, and I want to give you my share of the inheritance. Emily was raised by her father, Joseph. She did not remember her mother and did not know what happened to her. Her father didn't like to talk about it and always left her in different ways. As time went on, Emily grew older. Here, just to get away from questions about her mother was no longer possible. On one of the next days, the 16-year-old girl rolled the most real scandal. Why don't you tell me what happened to Mom? Is she alive or not? Why do you avoid this topic every time? How many times can you do this? Emily paced from side to side, trying to calm herself down, but it was having no effect. Her father looked at her sympathetically, realizing that keeping quiet on the subject had become too hot in their small family. Why are you silent again? Where's my mother? Why didn't you ever tell me where she is? Maybe I want to visit her. I want to tell her what's going on in my life, even if she never hears me. Emily had long ago concluded that something had happened to her mom, and that was why her father was keeping her tragic fate quiet. Perhaps it really would have been better that way. However, there was not a shred of truth in the girl's speculation. Sighing heavily, Joseph walked over to his daughter and put his hand on her shoulder. He looked carefully into the girl's eyes, trying to calm her resentment a little. But it was to no avail. Who the hell are you to withhold information about my mother? And the one that carried me under her heart, that gave me this life. You have no right to withhold that information from me. Who is she? Where is she? Tell me something about her. Emily screamed with helplessness, with the pain and resentment that had been lurking in her soul for so long. Tears streamed down her cheeks, which she stubbornly ignored. Joseph's heart clenched unpleasantly as the picture unfolded, and he exhaled convulsively. And gathering all his will into a fist, he muttered, "Your mother just didn't want you. We found out late enough in the pregnancy that there was nothing we could do. She didn't want to have you, didn't want to become a mother, thought she was too young for it, and convinced me too that you didn't fit into our future. But even before you were born, I felt that you needed me, that you were the ray of hope for a bright future that I was not ready to give up. She could never love you, and right after you were born, she wrote a rejection letter. I begged her to think about it. I begged her to stay and be with you for a while. I assured her that she would love you, but your mother was adamant. She didn't want to spend time raising a child. She didn't want to wake up at night. She didn't want to change diapers. She didn't want to lose her beauty through constant sleep deprivation and stress. And she walked away, leaving you so tiny and defenseless alone in the hospital." His voice shook, and he stopped, deciding it wasn't worth continuing the story any further. Emily stared at her father in silence, trying to comprehend what she had just heard and make sense of her feelings. The only thing in Emily's girl's eyes was the question why. But that's not what she asked her father. "And you didn't even try to find her, didn't try to show her what I've become independent and not requiring so much attention and care. Maybe she could have loved me, wanted to come back and start a family. Why didn't you try to make sure I had a mom like any other normal kid?" Emily switched to shouting again, not holding back her resentment and negative emotions. She looked at her father with incomprehension, trying to understand why he was so calm, why he was not worried, telling about how he just gave up the chance to build a normal family. The man looked attentively at his daughter, giving her a chance to spill everything that had accumulated. Then, calmly answered, "I tried. Gave her time to think about the decision and called only a few days after you were at home. But she didn't pick up that day, the next day, or the week after. She couldn't do that to me. She wouldn't leave me. She gave birth to me, carried me under her heart. Why doesn't she love me? Why do all mothers love their children, but mine abandon me?" Joseph gently pulled his daughter close, trying to calm her. Tears were already streaming down Emily's cheeks. Sobs echoed every second. He felt he had started this conversation early. But would there be a good time when the story of a child abandoned by her mother wouldn't resonate with pain? "I don't know, honey, I really don't. The only thing I do know is that I would never leave you. I would never hurt you like that. Would never let anyone take you away." The man fell silent, wondering whether to continue the story or drop the subject. After a few minutes of tense silence, he decided to continue so as not to return to the painful subject. "I tried to tell her what a beautiful little princess you are. I sent her pictures of you, wrote messages, letters to her parents, but all in vain. After a couple years, she blocked me, changed her number, her parents moved. I lost all contact and didn't know how to tell her about my growing angel." He stopped talking. Emily's shoulders shook with sobs. That was all he wanted to say, what she should have known about her birth mother. For several minutes, father and daughter stood in silence. Joseph was giving Emily time to realize the bitter truth. Gradually, she calmed down, her breathing evened out, but the trembling in her body remained. The girl looked into her father's eyes. "But since it happened, since she gave up on us, why didn't you just set up a life with another woman? A lot of people do that. I wouldn't have known she wasn't my mother. How could I lie to you like that my whole life? If I told you that the woman you thought was your mother wasn't, wouldn't you look for your mother? Wouldn't you want to know why you have a stepmother? Would you forgive me? After this?" Emily was silent. She had never before thought about how her father would have lived if he had had another woman. Would he have been happy with her, or would he have continued to blame himself for Emily's motherlessness? Would he have been able to never tell her that she was being raised by her stepmother? Or would she have found out when the time came anyway? The girl looked at her father carefully. There was no sadness in his eyes, no longing or any other feelings that expressed bitterness at the choice she had once made in favor of her own child. She gently put her arms around the man and spoke almost in a whisper. "If you are happy, I will be happy. If you want to build a relationship, you want to be happy and loved, then I will be happy if in your life there will be a worthy woman who will be by your side both in sorrow and in joy. You have the right to do as you see fit." Emily smiled. Joseph couldn't see it, but he could feel it. He could hear it in the timbre of her voice, in the way she snuggled gently against him, and the breathy way she spoke of what she was thinking. The man had never considered that model of a future with someone other than his daughter. She had always occupied all his thoughts, all his feelings. He couldn't imagine bringing a strange woman into the house and telling his daughter to call her mom. But now Emily had grown up, matured, and realized that there must be room for love in everyone's life. Maybe she was right. Perhaps he really should think about finding a worthy woman with whom he could meet his old age. But had he known how such a wish would end, he would have thought several more times before making life unbearable not only for himself, but also for a completely innocent man whom his daughter simply could not accept. No matter how hard he tried to make it happen. Time passed. Emily had already forgotten about that conversation with her father, after which the man seriously thought about his lonely future. After the departure of his daughter to study, despite his inner resistance, he still decided to give himself the opportunity to be happy and began to actively search for a woman with whom he could get closer, so as not to meet old age alone. A couple more months passed. Emily continued to go to school, studying hard but acceptably. In the absence of constant supervision, the girl felt free and completely left to herself, and therefore did not worry about bad grades, failed tests, and scandals with teachers. But only until her father was called to the school. One weekday evening, Joseph's phone rang. The man picked up the phone, and then after a second he looked at his daughter with some displeasure and contempt in his gaze. The girl immediately understood everything and wanted to leave, but suddenly her father gestured for her to return to her seat. Emily exhaled convulsively and sank back into the chair, squeezing her head into her shoulders, and already realizing what was going to happen. "Yes, thank you, I understand," Joseph said into the phone. "I'll try to come in tomorrow at lunchtime and talk to the history teacher about my daughter's progress. Thank you for calling. Have a good day." The last words sounded like a sentence, and Emily knew that under the circumstances she couldn't avoid a serious conversation with her father. She looked at him carefully, hoping he would cool down and not lecture her. But he wouldn't. The man moved closer and started talking. "Do you realize that no one will need you without an education? What do you plan to do with your life? Work as a janitor or maybe a cleaner? Or do you want to find a rich husband who will provide for you and not put you in anything? You will live like a bird in a golden cage, where you will constantly close your mouth and point to your place. Is that the future you want for yourself or what you're trying to achieve?" Emily lowered her eyes to the floor. She didn't like these conversations with her father and didn't expect teachers or the principal to decide to contact her father to discuss her grades at all. The silence was becoming oppressive. She had to say something to avoid looking completely stupid. "I just don't see the point of this story. Why would I want to know what happened before I was born and what I can't influence? It's just unnecessary information that will never be useful to me. Or do you think we're going to have uprisings or presidents being overthrown again? We're in a completely different time. And all this history I'm learning has nothing to do with our lives. I don't need it." Joseph looked at his daughter carefully. For such a young age, the reasoning seemed serious but also childish. "You should learn history, at least so that I don't get called to school on my work days, and so that I don't have to blush, because you don't think a history teacher is an important teacher. But that's my opinion. You've always taught me to stand up for it, to always stand my ground, to always fight back. And now you're saying it's wrong. What do you expect me to do if you can't decide how I should behave? And now you're telling me I have 7 Fridays in a week." Emily jabbed her finger and rose quickly from her seat to avoid further conversation. However, her father held her hand. My dear, you must understand the difference between standing up for your rights and violating the rights of others. Your rights end exactly where another person's rights begin, and you cannot violate them. The man let go of his daughter's hand, and the daughter, after staring at the gas station for a few seconds, abruptly turned around and went to her room. Joseph sighed heavily, anticipating not the most pleasant conversation with the teacher the next day, and not yet realizing that fate was preparing for him such a welcome and long-awaited gift. Barely free at lunchtime, Joseph hurriedly headed to school. Realizing that he didn't have much free time to spend talking to the teacher, it was easy to find the classroom. However, before he could even enter it, the man froze. Sitting at the teacher's desk was a young and attractive woman who looked completely lost in a classroom full of humming. It took a few seconds until Joseph was able to pull himself together and get out of his strange stupor, confidently entering the classroom and speaking menacingly. Everyone calmed down immediately. Who taught you to behave like this in front of adults? Or some of you want to replace the teacher and tell a new topic on your own for a grade? Let's also call the principal to see how smart the students in this school are. The class was instantly completely silent. Not even the rustling of textbook pages or any of the other rustles that are so common in classrooms could be heard. The woman gratefully looked up at her savior, trying to figure out where she could see him. Good afternoon. I was asked to come in to talk to you about my daughter Emily's 8th grade performance, and she's been a little off her game lately. And yesterday the principal pointed out that she's been especially bad in history class. So I thought I'd come here to talk to you in person. The man smiled bewilderedly, realizing that his appearance was a lifeline for the teacher, and therefore there was hope in his soul that she would somehow change her mind about his daughter. But how could she not? The woman nodded slowly, looking around the class and giving the assignment they were to complete while she spoke to the student's father. The classroom continued to be completely silent even after the adults stepped out into the hallway, which was a great indicator of how Joseph's words had affected the overall atmosphere in the classroom. Do you understand? Your daughter Emily, she does not consider my subject important at all, and therefore she does not learn anything, does not want to answer in class, does not do her homework. I tried to explain to her that it is necessary to study the material at least in order to successfully graduate from school and enter the direction that will be interesting to her in the future. But these words had no effect on your girl, the teacher began. And already at this moment Joseph realized that the conversation would not be very pleasant. She behaves terribly in class, constantly distracts other students, and sometimes even does everything possible to disrupt the class. I reprimanded her, called the principal to the lessons, used disciplinary measures. However, there was no result. Therefore, I had no choice but to call you to the school for an educational conversation. You must influence your child, otherwise she will not finish school with a good average grade, and this will have a negative impact on her future. I hope you realize that this is serious. Joseph took a deep breath. He had certainly expected nothing good to be said about his daughter during this meeting, but he couldn't even imagine it being this bad. He looked at the teacher carefully and tried to squeeze out at least a semblance of a smile. I'll do everything I can to influence her, he said, but you know it's not as easy as it may seem. I'm always at work, doing everything I can to make a decent living for her, so I don't have enough time to raise her. The teacher blushed visibly, whether from the man's words about doing his best and her judging him, or from the strange feeling that was growing stronger in her soul by the minute, making her anxious and breathless. The silence became tense, and the woman made an effort to break it. Forgive me for an inappropriate question, and why the girl's mother does not participate in her upbringing. Does she also work all the time? Or maybe you have younger children, and she simply does not have time for an adult child, who in this case is left to himself. Just at this age, a girl needs a lot of attention from her mother. Practice shows that it is mothers who have the greatest influence on the unformed psyche of the child. So you talk to your spouse or invite her to school so that I can talk to her. Maybe it will give better results. Joseph's eyes showed a faint pain that hadn't left him in years. He'd always tried to be the best father he could be, investing all his energy and money in his daughter, giving her all his free time. But apparently it was not enough. He could not bring her up to be a decent person, instill a love of education and respect for elders. He could not replace her mother. The man raised his eyes to the teacher, who watched his reaction confusedly. And as hard as it was to admit, he dared to say the words that had been running through his mind for so long. We have no mother and no one to replace her. Perhaps it was because of me, because of my desire to become a father, because I did not support my beloved in her decision to give up the child. Perhaps I am to blame for the fact that Emily has become so spoiled I can't give her enough time to be around her all the time, to help her with her lessons and personal problems. Perhaps if she had a mother, if I had made more of an effort to find and keep her. If Joseph had been a little more persistent and confident back then, his little daughter Emily would have been a very different person. Perhaps there is some truth in what is happening now and in the words of others. Maybe he's just a bad father who couldn't handle raising his own child. That's all there is to it. Joseph faked a smile, trying to look confident and convincing, pretending that he wasn't hurt by his own words, that he had long ago come to terms with what had happened and knew he was failing as a parent. He stood still, looking at the drawings on the floor in the hallway, and suddenly felt the touch of a warm woman's hand. "I'm sorry, I had no idea you had such a situation in your family," the woman said. "I am sure that you are a wonderful father and you are doing everything you can to make your daughter happy." The teacher looked at the man warmly, trying to convey her sympathy. "I didn't mean to hurt you or hurt you. Emily never said she didn't have a mom, or I wouldn't have brought it up. I'll try to be more sympathetic to her, and given the circumstances, I'll talk to the other teachers. We understand how hard it is for a girl to go through a difficult adolescence, albeit with the support of such a wonderful father." The woman raised her eyes to Joseph, who was looking at her with sincere gratitude. There was so much appreciation and warmth in his gaze that it made her uncomfortable, and she wanted to pull her hand away, but he intercepted it, pressing it to his chest. "Thank you so much. I am very grateful that you are willing to understand our situation and help my daughter with her studies. It's very valuable to us, and I'm sure Emily will do her best to improve her grades as well." "Well, thank you. But you can just call me Mary," the teacher said. "Thank you very much, Mary. You're a wonderful woman. I hope you have a good life. I have to go to work, or I'll be late after my lunch break, and that's not welcome in this company." "Yes, of course. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk to me about your daughter." Joseph turned to leave, but Mary called out to him. "Excuse me, but why don't I come over and talk to you about Emily's studies and grades? Perhaps my words will have some effect on her, and she will decide to get smart. It's not hard for me, if that's what you need." Joseph smiled warmly, nodded, and said gratefully, "I would really appreciate it if you would talk to my daughter, and I confess I would enjoy spending some more time with you. You're a very pleasant woman. We look forward to seeing you tonight then. I think Emily will be glad to have this kind of participation from her teachers." Joseph walked briskly toward the exit. Mary felt her face flush. She had a strange, frightening, yet pleasant feeling for Joseph, and she wouldn't mind spending a little more time with him herself. Emily took the news that her teacher was coming to talk to her about her grades very badly. "I don't need strangers giving me advice on how to live my life," she resented her father as she watched her father prepare for the history teacher's arrival. The man wanted to make the best impression, so he even left work early to clean up the house and prepare something for dinner. He didn't seem to mind his daughter's outrage at all. Joseph was absorbed in his own thoughts. "Do you even hear me?" Emily almost shouted. "I do not want her to come to our house and tell us how to live properly, how to behave, and how to treat her. I don't need her guidance and advice. I can fix my own grades in school, Dad." Joseph perked up, realizing how deeply he had thought about their recent acquaintance. He seemed to have found the one person he was ready to spend his life with, someone who made him feel at ease, who truly understood and supported him. But is it appropriate to date his own daughter's teacher? Does she have a husband or a young man? And most importantly, how will Emily react to the news that her father has fallen in love with the teacher, whom the girl, it turns out, sincerely hates? A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. It was Mary. As promised, the woman looked just fine, not at all reminiscent of the teacher the man had seen during the day at school. Her makeup, beautiful dress, and confident gait made her different from the hunted mouse he'd encountered. But that only added a fire to his gaze and made his new acquaintance even more attractive and alluring. "Good evening, Mary. You're looking very well. It's good to see you." "Good evening. It's nice to see you again, Joseph." Emily looked out of the living room, wondering what was going on in the other room, and since when her father had become so polite and courteous to women. But when the woman saw the girl looking intently in their direction, She immediately returned the businesslike tone and serious look she always used at school. I hope Emily knows what I'm here for, and that she and I are going to have a serious conversation. You warned her about this, didn't you? Of course I did. Emily's waiting for you in the living room. She knows what you've come for. Mary, as if ignoring the confusion on the man's face, went into the room where Emily was waiting for her. The girl was sitting on the sofa, making it clear that she was not happy about the situation and had no plans to talk to her teacher. Mary looked at her carefully and said, "Hi, Emily. Your father, Joseph, is a little worried about your performance in school. I know you're a smart girl, but lately your grades have been slipping. Why don't we talk about what's going on? Look, studying is an important part of life. It helps you decide your future career, develops your thinking skills and self-discipline. I want to help you, but to do that, I need to understand what's wrong. Maybe you find it difficult to learn the material or lack motivation. We'll figure it out together. Emily, you're an amazing girl with a lot of potential. I can see you trying, but something is keeping you from performing at your best. Let's find a solution that will help you learn the program and get you back on track. I will be there for you and will do my best to support you. Joseph is worried because he's worried about your future. He wants you to have lots of opportunities and prospects after school. But this is your life, and you will choose your own path. Our job is to help you go after your goals with ease and confidence." Emily looked at Mary, her teacher. She could see irritation in her eyes. Nevertheless, she decided to answer. "Mary, you are very nice trying to support me. But I know exactly what you're talking about. My studies, my future, my goals, they're all important. However, at the moment I just don't have the desire to make the effort. Maybe that will change later, but right now I'm not interested in cramming textbooks and writing tests. So unless you have any more new information or advice, we have nothing to talk about." Emily said it in a haughty tone, as if challenging her teacher. Joseph, who was in the next room, was upset at his daughter's behavior. Joseph was worried about Emily and wanted her future to be secure. He wanted Emily to grow up to be a decent, independent person, able to stand up for herself, provide for herself, and not need anything. His admonitions are attempts to help guide her on the right path. "I don't need your advice. I know how to live my own life," Emily said. "Stop telling me how to behave, what decisions to make, who to talk to. I'm an independent adult who can make decisions that affect my future. Stop telling me what to do." Emily, look, no one is prying into your life. We're trying to help you, to keep you from making serious mistakes that could negatively affect her. You see, we're not telling you what to do or how to do it. We're telling you, guiding you, helping you figure out how to do better. Mary put her soul into every word, trying to be tactful and pleasant, so that Emily understood the essence and stopped resisting, began to learn. But the result was the opposite. Emily looked at the teacher unhappily and spoke haughtily. "Tell those who need your advice about how to live better. I don't need them at all, and I'm sure that I can organize my life without your interference. Thank you for coming, but I don't intend to talk to you anymore. My friends are waiting for me. Have a good day." Without waiting for a reply, Emily stood up and headed for the exit. The door slammed. Joseph jumped up and walked quickly into the living room, expecting that it was his daughter's teacher who had left, not her. Looking confused at the obviously upset Mary, he sat down next to her and spoke quietly. "She's always been temperamental and explosive, and this has nothing to do with you. She's hard to please. She does things her own way. Do not take her behavior to heart. It has nothing to do with you." Joseph noticed the warmth and appreciation in Mary's eyes and, looking away, continued. "Thank you for trying to talk to her. It may not have been successful, but I'm sure she appreciated your attempt to help. But the important thing is that I at least tried to help you," Mary admitted suddenly, smiling softly. Joseph quickly looked at her in surprise. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to try to influence your daughter. I'm sure she and I can still find common ground. She's not what she wants to be. She is very vulnerable inside and hides it behind a mask of detachment." Joseph smiled at Mary and gently touched her hand. "I am very grateful that you were able to make time for my child. I understand that you have a lot of things to do and worry about. This is very important to me, and I must admit I was very glad when you came to visit us. I made dinner, by the way." It's not a work of art, of course, but I'd be delighted if you'd stay and try it. Mary agreed. The couple felt the attraction, but in a way they tried to hide it, to suppress the strange feelings growing inside, preventing them from thinking straight. But no matter how people fight fate, they still find themselves subject to feelings and desires. Joseph and Mary are no exception. The relationship between them spiraled rapidly. After a couple of weeks, Mary began to visit her new suitor more often and even stay overnight on weekends. Emily immediately noticed the change in her father's behavior. And at first she was even happy for him, but only until she found out with whom her father was building a relationship, and she wasn't going to accept his choice. "What's this all about?" Emily grudgingly asked her father during breakfast. "What is she doing in our house? Why is she even here?" Joseph looked at his daughter with incomprehension and spoke calmly. "You yourself wanted me to find a woman with whom I would spend my free time and with whom I would like to meet old age. And I found one. I began to control you less, give a lot of time to myself and my interests, and you became a fully independent person who makes his own decisions, without the constant nagging from me. What's wrong? Why aren't you happy with the choices I've made?" "Because it's not a choice," she said. "You just decided to start a relationship with my teacher so that she would do me favors at school. You decided that this way you could help me improve my grades. Well, I don't need that kind of help from you. Just know that. And you better stop this before it goes too far. Otherwise, you will regret it later, and it will be too late to change anything," the girl said grudgingly, watching her father's facial expressions carefully. "And what makes you think that I decided to start a relationship with Mary for the sake of your studies?" Joseph asked. "How so?" "It's plain and simple. I was having trouble with this particular subject. I refused to accept help from her the last time she came to our house, and you thought you could improve my grades just like that if you started a relationship with it." She waved her hand toward the bedroom. She waved her hand toward the bedroom where the woman remained, unable to find a decent word. "You decided to start a relationship with her to improve my grades, but I don't need that kind of sacrifice. Thank you very much. So, Daddy, you can dump her and live peacefully to yourself without this connection." Joseph listened attentively to his daughter, realizing that she really believed everything that was said and did not accept the possibility that he could just fall in love with his own daughter's teacher. Several tense minutes passed until he decided to tell Emily the truth. "Sweetheart, this has nothing to do with you," he said softly. "I realized that you didn't want control and that you were going to make all your own decisions. I realized that last time, so I left you alone. Gave you the freedom to take charge of your own life and make the decisions that would affect it in one way or another. I'm honestly not even sure I was doing the right thing before, trying to control you all the time. And now you have the opportunity to really make all the decisions yourself, to make the choices that will affect your life, without being constantly controlled by me or your history teacher." The man hesitated, trying to find the right words. "What about Mary? I love her very much indeed, and I want to build a happy relationship with her. They have nothing to do with you. No one's making any sacrifices to get you good grades and a happy future. I just realized at one point that I really like this woman, and apparently she feels the same way about me." Joseph smiled dreamily, already imagining a happy future with his chosen one, not paying attention to his daughter's unhappy grimace. Suddenly, Emily slammed her fist on the table, looking at her father with displeasure and saying through her teeth, "When I told you that I'd be happy if you found the woman you'd like to grow old with, I didn't mean that you should fall in love with my teacher, who would make my life at school simply unbearable." "You can't just start a relationship with her like that," Emily said grudgingly. "Everyone would know about it. What would happen then? What would they say about you?" Joseph shrugged his shoulders, expressing complete incomprehension of his daughter's displeasure. "What will they say about me? We're all adults and we understand that people fall in love," he replied. "I've spent my life raising you, giving you everything you could ever dream of. And now I want to feel happy and loved. I want to be with a woman who really loves me. I want to grow old with her. I want to spend every day at work, knowing that I will be waiting for me at home with a hot dinner. You see, I have the right to be happy too, no matter how old I am." Emily's gaze grew heavy. She looked at her dreamy father with obvious displeasure as she listened to his wishes and dreams. Emily looked at Joseph with obvious displeasure as she listened to his wishes and dreams. She hadn't expected him to find a woman so quickly. Emily had thought that he would have his personal life already after she left to study, and he was alone. Did he lack love and care from his daughter? Had he been unhappy spending time with her before? Was everything he said really true? But then why did it hurt so much inside? Why did every word he said make her so uncomfortable? Emily slowly leaned toward her father, leaving about 10 centimeters between their faces, and gritted through her teeth. "I'm sorry that you weren't happy because of me, and couldn't build the life you dreamed of because you had to take care of your daughter. Perhaps it would have been better if you had just given up on me. I would have gone to people who loved me instead of thinking of me as a burden." Emily abruptly pulled away from her father and headed for the exit. On the way, she bumped into her history teacher, Mrs. Mary. The woman smiled. "Good morning, Emily. I hope you remember that there's a history test tomorrow. Prepare well to pass it the first time." Mary wanted to touch the girl, but she took a step to the side, not allowing her to touch. Emily looked at the teacher with hatred. "I used to dislike only your subject, but now I sincerely hate you too. I hope you are happy with ruining my life." The girl quickly walked out, ignoring the teacher's incomprehensible look and her father's heavy sigh from the kitchen. She was so hurt, lonely and sad. She didn't think her own father would trade her for a woman he didn't know, be happy with her over his daughter, and choose her in the end. Tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving wet paths, everything squeezed inside. There seemed to be almost no air left in her lungs. The world was fading and becoming unreal. She walked on, not caring what road she traveled, just to get away from the house, not to see her father's happy face, and the one that had taken him away from his daughter. Emily didn't know how much time had passed, but when she came to, it was already dark. Looking around, the girl realized she was in an unfamiliar neighborhood. The fear inside made everything tighten. There was no one around to ask for directions. The phone was left at home. There was no money for a cab either. What to do? Where to go? After thinking for a while, Emily decided to walk in the opposite direction, hoping that on the way she would remember where she had come from. Emily felt herself getting more confused with each new turn. Tears rolled down her cheeks again, but now from helplessness and powerlessness. She didn't know where to go, she didn't know where she was or what would happen to her, and most importantly, whether anyone was even looking for her, or whether her father was only glad that such a burden as she was finally gone from his life. Inside, everything was shrinking from fear and not understanding what would happen next. It became scary to turn somewhere, to go in an unknown direction. There were sounds around, from which the girl shuddered every time. Complete darkness began to press on the psyche. The heart beat faster. It seemed that it was pounding so hard that it could break the chest. Suddenly, the girl heard some voices behind her back and turned around to see who had come outside to ask for help. There was a group of guys standing in the distance, talking loudly about something. They didn't see Emily, and so she decided to approach them herself to find out where she was and where she should go to get to the right street. But the decision made in fear and panic was not the best one, and Emily soon realized it. But it was too late. Approaching the company of guys, the girl felt a strange anxiety, which was different from the fear she had before. It seemed that getting too close was not the best decision. However, the guys had already noticed her, and were watching carefully as the frightened and completely lost girl slowly approached them. A grin appeared on the face of one of the guys, which obviously didn't bode well. But Emily still dared to ask. "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to Lincoln Street?" Emily stopped a few meters away, asking her question loud enough to be heard clearly in the company of the guys. Even so, no one was in a hurry to answer. One of the guys took a step closer to the girl, followed by a second and a third. They stopped just a couple dozen centimeters away from her. One examined Emily closely, and his smile only grew wider. Leaning over to her, he muttered, "What's a little girl like that doing alone? Baby time is long over at night outside, and you should be in your little crib." All the guys started laughing with glee, which made everything inside the girl feel as if she had fallen. She felt fear and excitement, realizing that it would not be possible to get rid of the attention so easily. But the main thing was to know where to go and not to provoke the guys. There were strange lights in the eyes of some of the strangers that only made Emily more nervous. It took a few dozen seconds before she was able to squeeze out a few words. "I was just taking a walk and got lost. And now I don't know how to get home." She had hoped that such a childish confession would make the boys realize that she was just a child with nothing to take from them. But it seemed that this manner of speaking only served to irritate the boys. One of them came very close to the girl and touched her shoulder. "How nice we are," he said. "You can't tell from the looks of us. You know, I especially like girls who are obedient, who will do whatever you tell them to do and don't ask questions. You're like that, aren't you?" The boy looked into Emily's eyes and she could see the evil lights dancing in his gaze. She wanted to run, but it was too soon. And where would she go if she didn't know how to get home? And running, not knowing where to go, wasn't the best solution. She'd be exhausted too quickly, and this group of guys would easily catch up with her. So we have to somehow turn the situation around so that they tell her where to go, and only then start running. "I'm sorry, but I just want to go home. My dad's waiting for me there. He must be very worried about me," Emily said in a shaky voice. Emily walked down the unfamiliar street. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. "Excuse me, can you tell me where to go? This is my first time here." Two guys approached her closely. One of them ran his fingertips through her hair. Emily felt an uncomfortable sensation but stayed where she was, trying not to provoke them. "If you behave and do everything we say, we'll walk you home ourselves afterwards so no one else can touch you," the other guy smirked. "But only if you're good, and if you get cranky." He lowered his voice deliberately, giving it an ominous tone. Emily realized she couldn't expect any help from these guys. She thought feverishly about what she should do. She couldn't think of a single sensible way to hide or get away from a group of tough guys who clearly looked stronger and tougher than she was. Her heart was pounding faster and faster, blood pounding in her temples. "So, will you behave yourself?" The other guy asked again, continuing to stroke her hair. "Or do you want to play naughty girl and get punished?" He leaned very close to her ear. "Hey, stop messing with her," shouted irritably the third guy in the crowd. "Let's get out of here. How long can we stand here? We're attracting too much attention." He moved toward Emily with determination. Realizing that there might not be another chance, she ran down the street, not looking back and trying to ignore her racing heart. A second's hesitation from the boys gave her a small head start, but soon she heard them catching up to her quickly. Emily realized what would happen if they caught her. She ran as hard as she could, feeling her legs jacking up. Turning corners, winding streets, her eyes were already swimming in multicolored circles from lack of air. The realization came that there was no escape. And then Emily bumped into someone on the sidewalk. She lost consciousness, but felt someone's strong arms pick her up. The next thing she knew, it was darkness, no thought, no feeling. When Emily regained consciousness, there was light all around. She was lying on a pillow, her body aching unpleasantly, reminding her of her recent adventures. Her throat was dry. Her eyes ached from the tears shed last night. Looking around, the girl realized she was in a hospital room and tried to raise herself, but she felt dizzy and weak. Slowly lowering herself back onto the bed, she decided to wait for someone to come and explain the situation. Suddenly, Emily noticed a rustle to her left and was startled to see the boy sleeping peacefully in the chair. Her insides clenched with fear. Had she been caught after all? Had they done something to her? And now someone from that company was sitting next to her, so that she wouldn't say anything unnecessary? Tears came to her eyes, and the girl decided to leave the room and find a doctor on her own. But when she tried to get out of bed, the guy woke up. He looked carefully at Emily and, smiling slightly in a sleepy voice, said, "I'm glad you've come to your senses." The doctor said that Emily had just had a lot of exhaustion and excitement happen to her, but the guy was still worried that those bullies might have done something to her. The doctors didn't want to leave him, but since Emily's cell phone was dead and she had fallen into his arms, he was allowed to stay and monitor her condition until her parents arrived, who were due to arrive soon. In the meantime, he would guard her sleep as best he could. The guy smiled again, and that smile somehow made him feel much calmer. "So you're not one of those guys who chased me so hard?" Emily asked tiredly, slowly lowering herself back onto the bed and closing her eyes. "I was already scared that you were with them and sitting next to me to keep me from saying too much or convincing me that everything was my wish." Emily exhaled convulsively, trying to catch her breath. "Don't worry, it's okay," Joseph replied. "They've all been detained until the circumstances are clarified. They tried to prove to me that they hadn't touched you, but I didn't believe them. Now let them think about their behavior behind bars, at least until you testify." The boy moved a little closer to Emily, peering gently into her tired and frightened eyes. "Didn't your parents teach you that it was dangerous to walk alone on dark streets at this hour?" What if I hadn't been around the corner? What if they'd caught up with you before you could get to me? Do you even think about the consequences of your decisions? Emily felt herself blush thickly. She didn't want to be lectured by a complete stranger. But there was truth in his words, and she decided to tell him everything that had happened that night so that she wouldn't seem frivolous. The boy listened to her attentively, and then, with a sigh, spoke. Yes, I understand you perfectly well. I myself had such things, misunderstanding from parents, quarrels and scandals. But you know, once my history teacher gave me a really good advice that changed my life. You know what she said? That no matter what emotions reign in my soul, no matter how much I want to leave, to stop communicating with my parents and get rid of their overly intrusive care, they are still my parents, who gave me life and sacrificed a lot to provide for me, to bring me up and give me a chance for a normal life. That's why I should treat them with respect, tolerate their quirks, just as they once tolerated my childish whims and tears. Of course, I couldn't fully accept their behavior and forget their mistakes. But you know, I think that advice did help me to be easier on them, to make concessions and to forgive some things. Emily lowered her eyes to the floor. Another piece of advice, another admonition, another attempt to pry into her life that she was so sick of. She sighed heavily, looked at the guy carefully and mouthed, "Thank you so much for saving me tonight. But I'll figure out how to live my life on my own. I don't need your advice and guidance. I'm sorry. I'd like to learn from my mistakes. Okay?" "No, you've got it all wrong," he smiled. "I was just sharing my life experience with you. I didn't want to teach you how to live or change your views and attitudes. I just told you how I see the situation, that's all." He went back into his thoughts. "I just realized I should have been closer to my mother. It was too late. At a time when I had no way to get close to her, or just have a heart-to-heart talk with her. Some mistakes teach valuable lessons, but the toll they take on our lives is too high." A few seconds later, there was a rustle in the hallway, and Emily's worried father came running into the room. He seemed to have aged considerably in just one night, and even changed in his face. The girl watched with incomprehension and some sympathy as his gaze frantically traveled over her, and then stopped on the boy who had remained close by. Joseph rushed to embrace his daughter, pulling her gently against him. Tears were rolling down the man's cheeks, and it looked so unusual that the girl was finally confused and froze in indecision, not understanding what to do and how to behave. She gently pulled away from her father, looking into his eyes and asking in all seriousness, "What's the matter with you? I've come home late before and stayed overnight at a friend's house without permission. And you've never been so worried?" "I always knew where you were and what was wrong with you." The man's voice trembled, and that made her feel even more uncomfortable. "And this time it seemed to me that something terrible had happened, that you would never come home." She was not used to seeing her father in such a state, not used to seeing him weak and depressed, and so everything inside clenched unpleasantly at the unfolding picture. She turned to the boy, who was watching father and daughter closely, and sighed. "Admittedly, I did get myself into a bit of a mess. But thanks to this young man," Emily pointed to the boy beside her bed, "it's all over, and I'm safe and sound now. I'm lucky I met him on the street, or I'm afraid to imagine what might have happened." She was silent, realizing that it was better for her father not to know the whole story, especially given the state he was in. Joseph immediately turned to the stranger and began to hug him. "Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking care of my daughter. She's such an impulsive but good girl. She's very lucky to have such a compassionate young man. I'm afraid to even imagine what could have happened if she had met one of those criminals that frequent the streets at night. There has been so much bad news already." The boy noticed the pain flashing in Joseph's eyes, and turning back to Emily, he noticed the pleading in her eyes. And it all became clear. He made the decision to keep quiet about everything that had happened as well. To calm the man down and not to complicate the life of the rescued girl, gently pulling away from the man's strong embrace, the guy adjusted his clothes and spoke in a calm voice. "You know, I think that's what anyone in my place would do. Leaving such a beautiful girl in trouble is not gentlemanly, so I couldn't do anything else. Besides, I didn't do anything wrong. I just brought her to the hospital after she passed out in the street." Noticing the anxiety, if not horror, in Joseph's eyes, the guy immediately hurried to continue. "But the doctors said she was just exhausted, and that's the only reason she passed out. She's completely fine. They'll take some tests in a couple of hours, and if everything is fine, they'll let her go home." He smiled, trying to make his words positive and convincing. but there was still anxiety in Joseph's gaze. He looked at his watch and then at his daughter and spoke. "I have to report to work now. I have a promotion coming up that will pay for my princess's education and I can't miss it. But as soon as you get all your tests done and are told you can go home, I'll come right over to pick you up." "Okay, sweetie? Or, if you want, I can ask Mary to meet you." No, Emily answered firmly, not even wanting to hear her father's suggestion. "I'll get home on my own, and I'm not going to let your Mary meet me. I don't need her help. She's the reason I left home. She's the reason everything happened. And you don't understand that, and you stubbornly don't see it," she said resentfully, folding her arms across her chest and turning away from her father, clearly showing that she didn't want to continue the conversation. Joseph sighed heavily, trying to understand how to please his daughter and keep his own happiness. At that moment, the stranger spoke. "You know, I'm on the car. Today I have the day off so I can take your daughter home myself after the doctors say that she is fine. Then you won't have to take off work and risk a promotion, and your beautiful daughter won't have to make concessions to be met by someone else." The guy smiled, waiting for an answer. "Of course, if you don't mind." Joseph looked at Emily carefully. Even in this situation, she was still cold and distant, and it bothered him a lot. After a few minutes, the man made his decision. "Fine, but if she doesn't want to go with you, just call me and I'll call a cab or come myself. It was nice to meet you." Joseph fell silent, realizing he didn't recognize the name of his daughter's savior. "Brian, it's nice to meet you too. I hope this isn't the last time we see each other." "It's nice to see such loving fathers," the boy smiled, extended his hand, and Joseph shook it in return, then walked briskly out of the room. "I can get home on my own. I don't need your help," she said almost in a whisper, despite Brian's presence. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you." The boy moved closer. At that moment, Emily felt her heart beat faster. "I'm telling you, I'm capable of getting home on my own," she said louder, deliberately moving away from her savior. "I don't need anyone's help or handouts. Thank you. But it seemed like you couldn't have gotten home on your own last night. Plus, your cell phone is still dead, and the hospital doesn't have a charger. How were you going to get home?" The guy reacted unhappily. "And you don't have money for a cab." Emily realized that she was in a desperate situation and would have to ask her nighttime savior for help anyway. "Okay," she muttered. There was a pause for a few minutes, in which everyone was thinking about something else, until the girl made up her mind. "Thank you for saving me. I'm afraid to imagine how things would have ended that night if you hadn't been there. Probably nothing good." "You're welcome," the boy replied simply and sincerely, looking into the eyes of the saved girl. "I couldn't leave such a beautiful girl alone. It was good that I went outside at that very time. It was like something was beckoning me to stand there. Fate, I guess." The girl was embarrassed by what she heard and hurried to look away, so as not to see the guy's smile, which gave her a wave of goosebumps inside. Brian, on the other hand, watched the girl's reaction carefully, trying not to miss anything and admiring the one that saw his soul. Emily was indeed discharged home. The tests were normal. However, the girl was advised not to overexert herself. She was released from classes for the next few days and recommended to undergo a full examination to find out the cause of fainting. As promised, Brian drove the girl home. Emily took her time getting out of his car, scrutinizing the guy. After a few minutes of silence, he asked, "Do you want me to walk you straight to the door, or can you walk yourself?" "I can do it myself," she replied. "Thank you for coming to my rescue and driving me home, despite my unbearable temper. And thank you for just being there for me the whole time. It was very important to me." Emily slowly leaned over to the guy and kissed him gently on the cheek. The warm touch of her lips sent shivers down Brian's body, and at that moment he realized that next to him was not just an accidentally rescued girl, but the one given to him by fate. The guy took Emily's number, and from that moment the couple's communication spiraled rapidly. After a couple of months, Brian offered the girl to meet, and she agreed. The relationships with him became a kind of outlet, which helped to distract from the constant reflections on his father and his new passport. Toward the end of the school year, Joseph decided to make Mary a proposal, so that in the summer to play a modest wedding and legalize their relationship. And that was the last straw in Emily's patience. She did not intend to watch her father build a life with the one she hated so much. And so the girl made a sharp, in her opinion, the only right decision to move out, and to tell her father about it she decided to immediately. "What are you leaving after the 9th grade?" Joseph said with displeasure, pacing from corner to corner in the living room and trying to calm down so as not to say too much to his daughter. "What about higher education? What about the prospects you've been striving for all these years? Are you really just ready to give up everything because of another whim?" And at that moment Mary came to him, who gently took his hand and looked into his eyes and gently said, "Let her make her own decision. She is an adult and can be responsible for her actions. We all learn from our mistakes. Maybe this will be a great lesson for her on how not to act in a situation, or maybe she will actually get what she wants out of life." Joseph exhaled convulsively. He wasn't ready to make that kind of decision from his daughter, and so the idea that it might be the right one seemed somehow unrealistic. Still, he decided to listen to his chosen one and closed his eyes and spoke. "Maybe you're right, and Emily really just needs more freedom. I just wanted to say that her decision seems wrong to me, and that I think it will lead to a completely different outcome than she expects. That's all. I didn't forbid her from making her own decision, nor did I say that she should give up her aspirations to please me. I'm just trying to keep her safe." "I understand, darling," Mary said softly, looking into Joseph's eyes. "But she's a big girl, and she can decide for herself how to be, how to behave, how to act in any given situation. She's not a little child, after all." The man sank down in his chair. He realized that it was really true, that it was time to give his daughter the opportunity to make her own decisions and dispose of her life as she saw fit. But the anxiety and worry wouldn't let him go. He looked up at his daughter, and only at that moment did he notice the unkind grin on her face. And in the next second, Emily spoke with displeasure and anger. Of course, who'd have doubted she'd say that? I've always been a bone in her throat, and now that she's had a chance to get rid of me early, she's not going to miss it. Still, I made the right decision when I realized it was time to move out. Otherwise, I would have had to endure 2 more years of a disgruntled look on my face and some stupid accusations against me. Emily forgot to put her shirt back on, or didn't wash her plate, or behaved inappropriately in front of guests. She thought that then a calm and measured life would come. As soon as I get kicked out of my own house, right resentment and dissatisfaction with the situation could be heard in Emily's voice. It was clear that the girl was not thrilled with the decision, but thought it was the right one. Confused by his daughter's words, Joseph muttered, "What does Mary have to do with it, if you yourself decided to move out after 9th grade? It's your decision, no one imposed it. Why, when Mary supported it, do you think she wants to evict you? I don't understand anything." Joseph looked at his daughter carefully, hoping she would realize the error of her ways. But Emily became even more disgruntled. "Of course you never see what's wrong," she glanced obliquely at Mary, who looked incomprehensively back and forth at her future husband and Emily, not knowing whether to intervene or remain silent. Joseph rose slowly and approached his daughter. Placing his hands on her shoulders, he looked into her eyes. "Sweetheart, why do you always have some strange competition with the woman I truly love? She hasn't replaced you for me. She hasn't become the only one I love. She has no prejudice against you. Contrary to your speculation, she's trying to connect with you, to get closer, and you're pushing her away. She's not replacing your mother, and she never intended to. But can't you have a warm relationship for my sake?" The man looked at his daughter with hope and tenderness, but her gaze became hard and displeased. "You knew from the beginning that I didn't approve of your association with my teacher. What made you think I would be thrilled to marry her? It's your decision, not mine. I don't have to support it. I'm sure she's only with you because of the house and work. Not the love you're talking about. You can see it in her." Mary sighed heavily, realizing that building a good relationship with Emily would be difficult, but she had no idea how much. Joseph replied calmly, "You're right, it's my choice and it's not your place to judge it. It's not like I'm judging your Brian and I'm trying to build a good relationship with him because he didn't interfere with our family, try to take me away from you, or tell me how to live my life. Since you're so happy with her, you should know that you lost me because you chose her." Her Emily shouted to her father through gritted teeth. She raised her head proudly and went to her room, hoping that the conversation would influence her father's decision to marry Mary. But it didn't. and the girl decided to move away from her father as soon as she received her diploma. Emily entered college in another city and from the first days lived with Brian. He rented an apartment, paid for groceries and expenses. While the girl was studying, Brian loved her unconsciously and was willing to do anything to make her happy and stay close to her. Despite her father's protests that it was too early for Emily to live with a boyfriend, she did her own way, as always. Joseph soon reconciled, taking Brian's promise that his daughter Emily would definitely get an education and only after that become a happy mom and wife. And boy did he promise that he would. Mary and Joseph played a wedding, to which Emily decided not to come. She did not want to be present at that celebration, which she absolutely did not approve of. But Brian was not in favor of such a decision. "Why don't you want to be there for your father on such an important day?" he said. "I think he'd like it if you could come, especially since the wedding is in the summer, before school starts, which is very convenient for you." They made sure you could get to their celebration without missing school. The guy watched with incomprehension as the girl tore the wedding invitations into small pieces, sitting on the living room floor. "I won't go where I'm not welcome," Emily replied. "And I wouldn't be welcome there, believe me." "But why do you think that? They sent you an invitation, and they took the time and effort to make it and sign it. They even invited you to come early to help organize the party. This is one of the most important days of your father's life." That's right, in his life, he made the decision to marry that witch. Despite the fact that I hate her, despite our terrible relationship, despite the fact that she treated me abominably and told me how to live my life, what to do, what to wear, despite the fact that I am an adult, an independent person. And she is the reason that our relationship with my father, which he spent so long building and cherishing, has shattered. I don't want to see him choose her over me. I don't want to see him give up our good relationship for someone who only values a spacious house and a big wallet. Emily closed her eyes and sighed heavily, trying to calm down and get her thoughts in order. She didn't want to think any more about the fact that her father had chosen some other woman over her, that he had made her the center of his life, and that he had made the decision to marry in spite of her displeasure. But Brian kept asking questions, trying to figure out exactly what had happened and why Emily had this attitude toward her future stepmother. "But she didn't do anything bad to you, right? She just fell in love." "She didn't fall in love," Emily cut her off. "She came into someone else's family and made her own rules that I had to follow. And my father, like a blind sheep, didn't want to see her leading him around and making him a tosser." "Well, maybe he was just really in love with her," Brian suggested. "He wanted to do everything he could to make her happy." "I love you very much too, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure that you don't need anything and can live the life you want. I always fulfill your requests." Emily looked at him unhappily. She didn't want to continue this conversation, and she certainly didn't want to waste her time explaining to him the problem and the reasons for his bad attitude. "Just trust me. She's not at all who she says she is," the girl said. "She's a disgusting, mercenary woman who will do anything to keep my father on a leash and bounce around on her hind legs. I know exactly what she's trying to accomplish, and she got it in the end. I tried to save him from this mistake. I tried to show him that he became just a slave who does not know anything and cannot distinguish lies from the truth. But he didn't listen to me. He made the choice she whispered to him. Let him suffer now." Brian was silent, realizing that the conversation would not lead to any expected result, and therefore there was no point in continuing it. Emily had almost completely stopped communicating with her father. She rarely returned his calls, hardly ever read his messages, and stopped coming home completely. She still considered him a traitor, didn't want to accept his decisions, and couldn't let go of the resentment that sat in her soul. Emily finished her studies and started working in her profession. 6 months later, Brian proposed to her. She accepted. It was decided to just sign, not to make a lavish wedding, and just spend the day for themselves. That's how it all worked out. They began to live together, to build their family life, and therefore there was no time to worry about her father and his new wife. Emily was completely immersed in her life, not yet realizing what a surprise awaits her from fate. One weekend, Emily's phone rang. She looked at the screen and saw Mary's name. Goosebumps ran down her body. Her stepmother was calling her, and she was the last person she expected to call. The girl blocked the screen, not wanting to pick up the phone, realizing that she wouldn't hear anything good. Suddenly, Brian's voice sounded. Who's calling you on your day off? Is it work again? Is there a problem? No, my stepmother has decided to ruin my life by showing up again, Emily answered. It's been so long, and she can't stand the fact that I don't want to be around their family. I'm sick of it. Well, maybe something's wrong. She's not just calling. Pick up the phone, at least to see what they want you to do. The guy looked out from behind the corner, looking carefully at the girl, who stood near the phone with a disgruntled expression. You just won't blame yourself, he continued. Then, if something's really wrong, and she's not just calling, you'll pick up the phone. Come on. Emily looked down at the phone, the ringing stopped, and she exhaled shakily. But at the same moment, the call came again. There was a strange excitement inside that defied description. After hesitating for a few seconds, she decided to pick up the receiver. Hello, she asked grudgingly, expecting to hear anything but what Mary would say in the next few seconds. Joseph. He didn't survive our automobile accident. The funeral will be on Monday. Will you be able to make it, or won't you be expected? Emily slowly slid to the floor. She expected to hear anything but that. Several minutes of complete silence passed before Brian looked out of the kitchen and was immediately stunned. His wife's face was as pale as a sheet, her eyes full of terror. He slowly approached her, looking into her eyes and asking with a tremor in his voice, "What's the matter? What did your stepmother say to you? What happened?" He crouched down beside her, trying somehow to figure out from the girl's look what had happened. "Daddy's gone" was the only thing the girl could whisper, and tears came to her eyes. She dropped her head to her knees, trying to suppress her sobs. Fear, pain, misunderstanding, and other negative feelings raged inside. Panic was rising more and more. It was getting harder to breathe with each passing second. Breaths were being taken. Circles appeared in my eyes. The funeral had gone smoothly. Emily didn't remember exactly what had happened, and the only moment she remembered was Mary, who was now confined to a wheelchair forever. It had been several months since the tragedy. Emily still hadn't fully recovered. She couldn't accept that her father was gone, that she would never be able to hold him again, to hear his voice. But as they say, trouble does not come alone. Emily's health took a serious hit. She was constantly visiting doctors, and sometimes even lay in hospitals for constant checkups. She lost a lot of weight, almost ceased to be happy about simple things, did not leave the house, and often cried. She literally wore herself out, not giving her body the slightest opportunity to recover from the tragedy. And she herself understood it perfectly well, but did not want to change anything. As time went on, the situation only got worse and worse. Emily thought it couldn't get any worse. After Emily's father died, her stepmother Mary said she needed her stepdaughter's help. She explained. "The doctor said I need constant care. I find it difficult to do simple household chores on my own, even cooking a meal. I don't have money for a caregiver. I understand that we had a bad relationship. You never loved me and didn't want your father to associate life with me. But since we've become related, we should help each other through a difficult situation." Brian expected Emily to react negatively, however she just nodded silently. She later told her husband, "I don't care. I'm just going to hire a caregiver for her. I hate her. I don't want to see or hear from her unnecessarily. I don't want to take care of the woman who ruined my father. She's not my family. I'll never be nice to her. I'd rather give my last dime to a caregiver. But I won't live in the same house with her. I don't care." Mary heard Emily's words but didn't object, realizing her stepdaughter wouldn't change her mind. It pained Brian to see his mother-in-law in need of help. He noticed that Mary looked at him carefully, and she thought his face looked familiar. As promised, Emily hired Mary a caregiver for her care and household chores. It wasn't cheap, so Emily took on extra work, staying late, doing what she could to pay the caregiver and have money for herself. This strain was taking a toll on Emily's health. She was losing her attractiveness and her health. Brian's entreaties to take on less work didn't work. Emily refused to help, seeing it as her area of responsibility. Over time, Emily's health deteriorated greatly. She constantly went to doctors, took tests, but no one could understand the cause. Doctors said that she was exhausting herself, not giving rest, and nervous tension leads to exhaustion. Brian looked at the doctor hopefully. "Isn't there anything that can be done? She's literally withering away, so young, and she has no vitality at all. She looks exhausted and tired. Isn't there anything we can do to help her? Are we just going to leave her like this? The doctor was silent for a while, then replied sadly, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. She is exhausting herself, and until she stops doing that, her condition will not improve. So you need to talk to your wife on your own. Explain to her how important this is, that she has to live for you, for your happy future. There's nothing I can do until your wife wants to live. Do you understand me? Brian walked out of the doctor's office depressed. He realized that nothing was going to work because Emily wouldn't listen to him. He had tried talking to her, urging her to eat better, sleep better, work less. But all these talks had no effect. He realized that his entreaties were useless, and there was no way out. Brian was not going to give up, so he decided to make one more attempt. Honey, how about we go on vacation? There'll be lots of good food. We'll vacation together and spend some quality time together. We should do that, don't you think? I have to work. I can't go anywhere yet. I can't just take days off. I can't let my bosses down. If I don't, I won't get my bonus. And if I don't get the extra money, what's the point of my job? If I don't bring anything to our family? Brian looked carefully into the girl's eyes and saw so much pain and despair in them that he felt uncomfortable. He took the girl's hands in his own, gently moved closer to her, and gazed into her eyes. Please, Emily, for my sake. Let's take a vacation, relax, spend time together, and taste so many delicious things. It's been so long since we've been alone together, without work and worries and cares. Let's just be together. I'll pay for the caregiver, all your mother's expenses. Let's just be together. Emily looked at her husband with tired eyes. She didn't want to decide anything, didn't want to take part in any of these fights, didn't want anything from this life. The silence was becoming tense, and Brian realized that his wife's answer was obvious, but he hoped she would agree to spend some time with him. I'm sorry, but I don't want to pass my responsibilities on to you. I promised my stepmother that I would provide her with a caregiver, and that responsibility is mine. You don't have to take over. We'll definitely spend time together when I get a promotion, or when I don't need a nurse. It just takes a little time. Okay, Brian replied, realizing that his wife wasn't going to change her mind or agree to drop everything to spend time with him. But Brian and Emily were not destined to spend a single vacation together as husband and wife. One night the girl became very ill. The ambulance came quickly, but the doctors could not help in any way. Severely exhausted body almost did not fight for life. And a few days later, Brian received a call from the intensive care unit with sad news. Funeral arrangements were made quickly. Emily had never said where or how she wanted to be buried, but Brian was certain that she should be next to her father, that this was the place she rightfully belonged. He handled the arrangements entirely on his own, not allowing anyone to interfere with his advice and guidance. He knew how best to do things and understood perfectly well how things should be. He had buried a loved one before. But at the time of the last funeral, the last time he had seen his mother's lifeless face, he had thought he would never be hurt like that again. But Brian was wrong. This time the pain seemed dozens, if not hundreds of times worse. He wanted to scream, to cry, to be hysterical, but he held on with all his might. He knew that his tears wouldn't help, and probably would only hurt Emily's loved ones more. That day had left an indelible mark on his heart that he would never get rid of, that would always be with him, and that he would have to accept and learn to live with. He could not imagine that he had so little time to enjoy life with the one he loved. After the funeral, the tears flowed. He could not calm down, he could not pull himself together. So after the funeral was over, after breakfast, he came to his sick mother-in-law's bedroom to do what he had long dreamed of. He fell into her lap, shaking with sobs that he could no longer hide. Pain, resentment, longing, and frustration all blended into one emotion that would not let him go. He didn't want to live, didn't want to do anything else in this life. He felt like he was all alone again, a lost and unwanted boy who wandered the empty streets at night. I remembered you at my husband's funeral, Mary said. You looked at me like that. No, but I didn't remember that look until later. You were the lost boy who needed support and advice. You're the Brian who couldn't recover from losing his mother and who didn't even want to live. You've grown so mature, so strong and beautiful. I knew you would become a beautiful man, but strong people need care and support sometimes too. Need someone to say a few affectionate words, to comfort them in misfortune and help them cope with the most intense sadness. It takes someone to support them, to stay by their side and sincerely believe that everything will be fine. And if you have no one else, if you yourself no longer believe that something else good is in store for you in the future, then I will do it in your place." Mary gently ran her hand through the man's hair, inviting him to share her sorrow and trying to convey in such a simple gesture all the love and care she felt in her soul. She wanted to share it with someone who really needed it. Why me again? Why am I alone again? Why does fate have such sad plans for me? Why can't I just be happy? Can't help but lose the people I care about more than myself. Why can't I? I just can't be happy like all the people around me. And why things don't work out the way I want and desire. Why? Brian continued to lie on his mother-in-law's lap. Tears flowed silently down his cheeks. It seemed that he had already accepted the inevitability of his fate, that he no longer resisted it at all, and that he was ready to accept everything that was happening to him. But Mary was sure that it was not yet over. "You know, for every major trial, fate sends you a gift, something you've wanted or needed for a long time," she said. "She doesn't just send you trials, she tests you for resilience to thank you afterwards for all your suffering, for your perseverance and persistence, and for the fact that you don't just give up and go to the end. Now you will always have me. I will be there for you. I will support you in any situation, always help you with advice and deeds if you need it. I will help you to get out of this abyss, as I once helped you to cope with the darkness that surrounded you so quickly. I won't leave you alone. I'm not going to let you just give up. Just remember that you are not alone." The woman gently pressed the man to herself, trying to convey all her warmth and confidence that tomorrow would be better than today, and that in the near future everything would be much better than now. The next morning, all the neighbors were shocked that Brian had fired his mother-in-law's caregiver and started taking care of her on his own. He realized that he could not and did not want to stay alone, and that the best solution would be to spend his life with the person who would really help in a difficult moment, who would be there for him, who would support and help with advice, and who would not betray and would not leave in a difficult situation. Brian didn't just start doing all the household chores on his own. He also worked hard on his mother-in-law's health. He wanted to make sure that her life was safe and that she would be able to live many more happy years, even if she was confined to a wheelchair. In the meantime, the doctors were giving a good prognosis, and that made the guy feel much calmer. He was able to calm down a little and began to try to live on. Now, not only without his mother, with whom he once parted not on the most pleasant note, but also without his favorite woman, for whose sake he was ready for a lot, but could not do anything to convince her to live on. Perhaps there was a reward ahead of him for such a serious ordeal, but maybe it was just an experience that he will just have to accept and move on with his life.